Ooh, it got brighter. Yes. There you go. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to day 2 of the J.A. Roy Borden Public Intellectual Interrogating the Caymanian Society. We're so very happy to welcome you all. Those of you who are joining us here at the Hartwell Theatre, or whether you are joining us online via YouTube, courtesy of CIG TV, we're just so very happy to welcome you all. A special word of welcome, of course, to Mr. Roy Borden, who is here with us. I just want to invite those of you who are online, and if you are able to today, pop in, please. The atmosphere here at the theatre is absolutely wonderful. This is our Cayman Islands Theatre, and we would be more than happy to welcome you. Yesterday, we had just about 1,000 views, so the audience that is here for the symposium is much larger than what we're seeing in front of us. But it is my absolute pleasure to welcome all of you on behalf of the Cayman National Cultural Foundation and also on behalf of the Committee for the Promotion of Research and Cayman Scholarship, both of whom are hosting this event. I am Dr. Stephanie Fullerton Cooper, and I will be your moderator for today's event. We are going directly into our first panel, and I'm very happy to welcome our panelists. I am, just as we did yesterday, going to be introducing each speaker, and they will come up in the order in which they have been introduced. Our panelists today are the Honorable Dr. Mary J. Lawrence, MBE, JP, former Speaker of the House, and an authority on the history and development of the Cayman Islands. Her topic is the cultural context of Roy Borden and his writings. Then we're happy to welcome Dr. Steve McField, attorney at law, author and historical, constitutional, cultural, and political commentator. His topic, Independence or Not? Tensions in the Writings of Roy Borden. Also joining us via Zoom is Mr. Beliki Simamba, a UK and Canadian trained lawyer and legislative counsel who spent 12 years as a senior government legislative counsel in Cayman. His topic, accountability of judges and government lawyers falling short of the ideal. And our final speaker today will be Dr. Henry Mutu, the artistic director of the Cayman National Cultural Foundation, one of the Caribbean's foremost theater arts practitioners and a household name in regional theater, arts, and cultural practices. His topic, transcending actuality, signifying our mindscape. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. Put your hands together with me as we welcome our first speaker, the Honorable Dr. Mary J. Lawrence.
Good morning, everyone, all our listeners here in the theater and those listening via various media. This is a very special occasion in our Cayman community, and I am honored to have been asked to be a part of it. Much was said here yesterday by erudite scholars who sought to analyze the several works of Caymanian author James Arthur Roy Borden, and offered their considered opinion, professional opinions that is, on the academic and historical significance of his writings. Scholars today will add to that examination, and hopefully at its conclusion, we will all have a better understanding not just of this author, but who we are as an individual and a country, and perhaps understand that we too have a role to play in writing the history of the Cayman Islands. My approach will be different. I have been privileged to have known Mr. Borden all his life. We have several things in common. We come from the same town, Bodden Town, and carry the same family name, Bodden. I grew up in the middle of the town. He grew up at the entrance to the town, and I have the distinct advantage of a few calendar years. Bodden Town, both the district and the town, is an area steeped in history. Indeed, it is the only district and town to carry the name of the founding fathers. It was from our town that the governor of Jamaica would draw 3 men, William Bodden and his 2 brothers, and charge them with the task of establishing law and order in a lawless society. From it would flow the first form of organized government, the magistrates and principal inhabitants, the first organized court, the first laws, the first church, the first school, the first representative government, the assembly of justices and vestry, the first micrograduate, the first trained teacher, the first trained nurse, the first trained public health nurse, the first trained Caymanian education officer, and I could go on. It is a town that prides itself on its scholastic achievements, down to the fact that the boys going to sea were considered literate and numerate. I could go on, but that is a subject for another time. And if you want to know more, let me put in a little advertisement here right now. In Bodden Town, we have a heritage site manned by the Bodden Town Heritage Committee. We've been at it for 18 years, and it has the best collection of Caymanian history and artifacts in the 3 islands. You're welcome to come and visit at any time. Mr. Bodden and I have another thing in common: the desire to preserve for posterity in all its various forms the history and culture of our people, and our enduring belief in the power of the written word. But why write it down? In this technological age, why not just record it on a CD or a DVD or in one of the other high-tech mediums available today? I had that question answered for me in the BRAC when I was charged with organizing the celebrations for Her Majesty's Diamond Jubilee in the 3 islands. The question arose as to what should be included in the proposed time capsule. Someone suggested recording on DVDs and CDs the information we wanted to preserve. The young tech man who was assigned the task of putting it together looked at us and said, "Write it down." 20 years from now, even if the CD or DVD survived, you probably won't have a machine to play it on, he said. Write it down on paper. Written history, whether on a papyrus scroll, a stone, the walls of a cave, an ancient building, entombed in a pyramid unearthed by a team of archaeologists, or on the pages of a long-lost volume, has man-made and natural disasters to tell us thousands of years later the story of civilization, who we are, where we come from. The young man was right. Mr. Bodden writes. He records the history and culture, both as he researched it and as he has experienced it. He adds the colorful flavor of the folklore tales, which had been passed down orally from generation to generation in the Bodden Town community. Tales gleaned from his eavesdropping days on the gathering of old men. He gives each thought-provoking morsel a permanent dwelling place in the consciousness of the reader. Until his arrival on the literary scene, few attempts were made to write down Caymanian history. In fact, our people bought into the idea that we had no history or culture to preserve or emulate, and thus found it easier to copycat the habits and speech and dress of those who came to live among us. Giving them an unwarranted level of superiority, no person should be allowed in another man's country, a supercilious attitude that has permeated every level of our society. As a history teacher, Mr. Bodden was called on to follow the curriculum which promoted the history of other lands, since it was not deemed feasible by the powers that be to teach the thousands of students passing through the education system even the simplest facts concerning their own country. One was not surprised then that his first volumes would tackle the dearth of knowledge in the wider Cayman society. His two subsequent books recording the folklore stories which challenged the imagination, plus a book of poetry and more recently an autobiography, none of which, even today with an education budget of over $80 million annually, has found their way into the country's classrooms. That is proof, yet again, that there's a glass ceiling when it comes to promoting things Caymanian, even its literature. But I digress. Some years ago, when he launched his book, A Gathering of Old Men, I was asked to be a presenter at the occasion. Of all his works, I think is the publication that most prominently captures his cultural background and encapsulates his desire to pass on to future generations their history. I won't attempt to analyze the book, but rather to share today the background for its writing. The essence of the book is not in its contents, but in its title, A Gathering of Old Men. The simple phrase covers not just the people, not just the contents of its pages, but evokes in my mind's eye the coming together of our people through the pages of our history to discuss and make meaningful decisions for community and country. A time when open discussion of any subject was a part of our daily lives, and opinions offered were listened to with respect and given due merit. That significant part of our culture and heritage was buried in the ensuing years under the tsunami carefully labeled growth and development. What then was the gathering of old men? If you had lived 60 or 70 years ago, as we did, in the Cayman Islands, you would have observed across the length and breadth of this island the gathering of old men. Each evening, and sometimes even in the daytime in Georgetown, men from the community would get all dressed up. In their evening clothes and gather to share the stories and events of the day. They never assembled in their dang-dangs, as they called their working clothes. This gathering was like a ceremonial gathering, and due respect was paid to it in the way they dressed. As the years rolled by, younger men coming home from sea added their stories to the older men, though they had to respectfully wait their turn to do so. It was a rite of passage to be considered old enough and man enough to be included in the gathering. In each district, there were special spots set aside for these gatherings. For example, in Bodden Town, they gathered at Guardhouse Corner, Mr. Biddle's shop, Mr. Logan's shop, where there was a wall to sit on. Wooden boxes made favorite seats, and some places even had a railing you could lean on. In Georgetown, they gathered along the breakwater in Hogseye Bay, or in front of Mr. William Nixon's shop on Mary Street, or in front of Mr. Shirley Macfield's shop on Shedden Road. This was not the bar crowd. These were not just tellers of folklore. These were serious-minded men from all walks of life, contemplating the world they knew, the things, the events that impacted their lives. Every now and then, there would be a pause in the cadence of their voices as someone lit a pipe or swatted mosquitoes with a sisal brush or stoked a smoke pan or just paused to digest the latest morsel of news or words of wisdom. If you were like young Mr. Bodden, small enough to blend into the deep shadows and could remain still and unnoticed for long periods, well, you could listen in on the conversations. I believe it was these cramped moments in the early life of this avid reader that planted the seed in him to write it down. And thus we have some of the tales he heard from a gathering of old men, men who, like clockwork, gathered in the evening in his neighborhood. But who is this author? And why does he feel compelled to record and tell these tales in the present age? We laud him today, but his journey to this moment has been a long and rocky one. This is a good time to remind ourselves, too, that Mr. Bodden's work as an author is just one part of this complex man. He's a son, a husband, a father, a student, a teacher, a politician, a professor, a college president, an active member of his church, even taking the pulpit at times, I believe, though I have not heard him singing, and yes, a farmer in his spare time. As the eldest in a family of 5, he took his responsibilities to his 3 sisters and brother very seriously, supporting their dreams and helping them to set and realize their goals in life. His mother's legacy of family and caring were deeply imprinted in his soul. Roy Borden was born James Arthur Roy Borden on the corner of Guardhouse Hill, the entrance to Bodden Town. From that vantage point, he was able to observe the movements of the entire island as the people flowed from east to west and west to east. He grew up in an age when boys went to sea to earn a living to supplement the family's income. One of my most vivid memories of him in those early years was of him sitting on the corner of his parents' home with his knees pulled up and a book propped up on them. He sat there so his mother, who washed and ironed clothes for all and sundry under the grape tree nearby, could keep an eye on him while she worked. Other boys in the neighborhood were running around, going to the beach, swimming, playing, having fun, waiting for the day when they would turn 16 and could sign up to go to sea. Not Roy Borden. Miss Sunshine, I didn't know her real name until I wrote her life story at her funeral. Miss Sunshine was determined that her oldest son was not going to do that. He was going to college. They had lost their father at an early age, but she never wavered in her plan. In fact, it made her more determined. Roy Borden was going to college. She worked harder, earning a reputation island-wide for her hand-done laundry. With the earnings, she paid for extra tutoring and made him read everything she could get her hands on. Books were scarce in that day and age. She made him go to school, and Sunday school, and church. And yes, the day came. Roy Borden went to college. His academic standing earned him one of the rarest scholarships offered in those years. It took him to the prestigious Michael College in Jamaica, where he would pursue his dream of becoming a teacher. On graduation, he returned home and took up a teaching position, first in West Bay, and then as headmaster at the East End All-Age School, where his zeal for learning and interaction in the community, as well as with his students, earned him the moniker teacher. Eastenders still call him teacher today. Moving on, several years later, he was placed at the Cayman Islands High School, which was government's first attempt at secondary education in the late 60s. His quest for learning would take him on a 4-year course of study to Canada, earning a bachelor's degree at Trent University, followed by a master's degree from the prestigious Queen's University. Like all young people in our town, he came and went in and out of our home on vacation time. And when he graduated, came to see me at the Nor'Wester magazine, where I worked as senior writer and assistant editor, to share with me the thesis he had written. I was impressed and got his permission to print it in 2 installments in the magazine. By the time the second installment came out, we were both wearing the big C label. We were communists. From the floor of the Legislative Assembly to the streets, the word went out. As an added insult, they tagged him as Black Power. The movement, they opined, was triggering the unrest in the Caribbean region. As for myself, I was that woman, a title I had enjoyed for many years before that. Why? Why such a vicious attack on a most prominent, most promising citizen? Well, in that thesis, he had dared to voice his opinion that Caymanians should not sell out their inheritance. The anger was palpable. How dare anyone say such a thing? Who did he think he was, promoting ideas like that? The controversy generated by that first publication of his writings, and I feel guilty sometimes when I think about it, would haunt him for years and years to come. He was a teacher in a country woefully short of teachers, but viewed with suspicion. The powers that be did not want him putting his way out ideas in children's heads, they said. He would end up mixing cement or accepting any other form of manual labor from anyone who would dare to offer him a day's work. He would try the political arena, but the tales followed him there too. No way was this educated upstart going to get their vote. It was the verdict of the power bloc, and it found ready ground in the town he had grown up in. The rejection was a bitter pill to swallow, but he did what his forebears had done. He put one foot in front of the other and plodded on. Eventually, he got a break to manage a car company, and the long wait for recognition began. His success at the polls would come later, but politics was not his first love. When one listens to his speeches in the Legislative Assembly, now called the Parliament, one could hear the frustration in his voice as he said, "I hail from the halls of academia." As Minister for Education and Labor, he would find yet again that change generated by him was still viewed with suspicion. But he had set a goal, and though the odds were often not in his favor, he continued to push his program forward. In 2004, he built the Prospect Primary School, a $12 million investment regarded as reckless expenditure. And once again, he would feel the lash of criticism. The fact that the building would offer shelter to hundreds during the Ivan hurricane that year, and in its devastating aftermath, did not lessen the vitriol. He had had enough. He decided to retire from politics and write the book that had long been burning a hole in his consciousness. His concentration for the next several years was on his writing, 2 annals of history and a book of folklore stories. He would come back to his first love, education, with his appointment in 2009 to be the president of the University College of the Cayman Islands. His impact on the development in all areas of that institution was recognized on his retirement when he was named President Emeritus, the first person in the Cayman Islands to receive such a prestigious accolade. He continues to write a book of poetry, an autobiography, and as I understand it, he's filling yet another volume. Do I agree with everything he has written over his journey as an author? No, I don't. In fact, we have stood on opposing sides on many issues. Does he agree with everything I say or write or do? No, he does not. But we respect each other and find the ensuing dialogue stimulating and rewarding. As a young Caymanian in those early years, I believed he deserved to be heard. Our inability to listen to the views of others, in particular youth, has often deprived our community of the benefits which come from considering different viewpoints and locked us in the noisy rhetoric created by our promotion of one size fits all. Over the years, whether in education, politics, or just as a member of the community in which we both still live, despite all the political rhetoric, I have made it my business to offer my opinion to Mr. Bodden, whether he liked it or not. At the same time, I will tell you without reservation, I am proud of the man he has grown up to be. Proud that even now he's still trying to challenge our thinking, our perspective on things, still trying to improve the world our young people are growing up in, still trying to raise their vision beyond the now to the broader horizons of the future. A gathering of old men brought the past to our doorstep as it reminded us yet again of the value of dialogue. Many changes have been wrought in the past 7 decades. In 1943, our population stood at less than 7,000. It's 10 times that today. And even in 1960, it had only increased by 1,500. In 1961, the country's income stood at £231,042, with expenditure listed as £219,561, a balanced budget. In 1950, there was no electricity in our island. One small plant in Georgetown offered a few hours of service in the evenings, sporadic at best. It would be another 20 years before the first island-wide service by CUC reached Bodden Town and enabled us to have the modcons we enjoy today. No asphalt road, no dock, no airport, no free secondary education, no banks, no big buildings, no tourism, industry, no development, no jobs to go to, no written constitution, no universal suffrage, no national recognition. We were still a dependence of Jamaica. No local currency, limited communication with the outside world. Land was £2 an acre on the 7-mile beach corridor, and on the list goes. But even as the material goals were set and met, the island's most precious commodity, its people, were being devalued and replaced. That rapid acceleration of development in those years raised serious alarm among the young people of Mr. Bodden's era and engendered a vicious pushback from those wielding power. He was not the only victim. Mr. Bodden, looking on to the present age, must shiver in reminiscence, even as he acknowledges that the youth of today have better tools with which to fight back. For the same problems still exist. A lack of national identity, of recognition of who we are as a people, our inability to find common ground on which to gather in dialogue, our lack of long-term planning and setting of priorities, our ad hoc management of our country's natural resources, our reluctance to hold our elected leaders accountable, our lip service to youth and their inclusion in nation building, our abdication of our role as protectors of our heritage, and on that list goes. In truth, this symposium is not just about Mr. Bodden, it is about us. Let this be a challenge to learn more about us, and most of all, to understand that we are mere caretakers of this unique inheritance. Our duty, our responsibility, is to add to it in a positive way, to make it an inheritance fit for the next generation. We write on the pages of history today, just as the old men did all those years ago. 20 years from now, what will the next generation read? What kind of trail will we have blazed? Let us join Mr. Bodden in challenging our young people to think, to dream, to work, to be open to new ideas, to be discerning in their choices. For together, we build this country. May God bless us all. Bless Mr. Bodden as he continues to make his contribution to these islands in all the several areas of education. And may God bless these beloved Cayman Islands, our home. Thank you.
A fitting start to day 2, quite an insider's view of the man. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to allow 5 minutes for questions. Does anyone have any questions for Dr. Lawrence?
Miss Mary, do you have any opinion on why the community has evolved this way. From we look back at, you know, the gathering of old men at the Big Gun at various places all throughout the island. But it seems that maybe from the mid-'80s upward, there does not seem to be the inquisitive mind or wanting to know about our heritage when we have such a rich heritage.
In a small community like ours, it is very easy to influence the thinking of people. We did not even have, in those early years, newspapers, and I would draw attention to the fact that for the first time since the 1950s, we don't have a daily newspaper in the Cayman Islands. And I think it is significant that the press is the area of the community that shrinks when certain viewpoints wish to be invited in the people's minds. I think that we have found, over the years, as a writer in the Nor'Wester magazine, for example, in the newspapers here, it is only today that people value the writings of that time. This was in the 70s and 80s. It is only today it is valued, because then it challenged the status quo. And the status quo in this island has always been controlled. And we find ourselves, if we challenge it, if we say anything about it, we become victims. Our voices, there has to be a way to silence our voices. As I stated, in Mr. Bodden's time. And today, we are faced with the fact that young people are saying, preserve our inheritance. But when he said it then, he was labeled as a communist. He was told he's a young man coming back, a young educated man with a master's degree from Queen's University. But his words, which might influence the young people of that day, were distorted and made into a weapon that would beat him over the head for the next many years of his life. We find ourselves in a position in this country where we are afraid to share our opinion. We're afraid to open our voice, our mouths, and say something that might be different from what the status quo is. We find ourselves, I have people who come to me even now and say, Miss Mary, you need to say this. And I said, why don't you say it? Well, you see, they're going to come after my job, or they're going to come after my children. There's always this fear in people's minds that there is a power out there that can make them lose the ground they have gained. And so today we have our young people coming back to this country, like Mr. Bodden did many years ago, with degrees and qualifications, and can't find a job. I know my own grandchildren has experienced it. My own children experienced it. It is, you have to be, you know, we have a little thing saying around here that says, who you from and where you come from. Well, if you come from Bodden Town and you open your mouth, you're in trouble. Because over the years, it has become known in the community that Bodden Towners always spoke out. And so we have to silence that voice. We have to silence the voices that raise questions. We don't have dialogue anymore. We don't talk to each other. You go to a restaurant and a family is sitting down and each person has a phone in their hand. And they're talking to someone other than the person in front of them. We don't dialogue with each other anymore. We don't talk with our children. We don't share our heritage with our children. The Bodden Town Heritage Committee went to the high school recently. We put on exhibitions in schools, and we go and we spend the whole day there and allow the classes to come in and view it and to question us. And out of the groups that came through there, not one child could name the premiers of the Cayman Islands. Not one. In fact, one looked at Mr. Panton's picture, which was in prominent display, and says, I think he's named Mr. Panton. But they didn't know he was the premier. Where are we going in this country when we are not teaching our children who they are and where they come from? When we are not putting value on them? And you know, this teaching must not just be for our children. It must be for those who come here as well, for they must learn to respect who we are. And until we have that dialogue, that ability to communicate with those who come here, that ability to that desire to educate our own children. As I stated, Mr. Bodden has written 6 volumes. You don't go in a school and find one of them. You say, well, you know, the history might be a little bit much for primary school children. But what about the stories? Why is it that we have this great reluctance to introduce our children? We had people run in this last election who had never read the Constitution of the Cayman Islands. How do you run for politics and you have not read the Constitution? We have to find a way to disseminate information to the people. And the written word, in my opinion, is still the best way. I can pick up a phone and look at it and see something that somebody has written. But I only see what fills that screen at that time. You need to have a book in your hand where you turn the pages and you see it, and you can go back the next morning and read it again and again and again till it's fixed in your consciousness. Sorry, I went on and on. That was a long answer to one question. Is there anyone else?
Ms. Lawrence,
Yes.
I've asked this exact questions in other gatherings in the past, but it burns into my mind a question that needs and should be asked. About 4 years ago, I had the distinct pleasure of being at a meeting, a gathering at UCCI, when the then education minister promised the audience, and a large one it was, but it was also getting on to a pending election. The promise made was that Mr. Bodden will be contracted to write the curriculum and the textbooks for the school at that time and going forward. It may be a difficult question for you to answer, but I would be very pleased, and so will a bunch of others, if you can put any insight at all on what has happened, hence that important promise. A promise that in fact would have boded very well for some of the questions that's been, well, statements that's being made here today, and the damage that is wrought as a result of not having been put into effect. I thank you.
The political arena is an arena in which many words are said, and many promises are made, and few are kept. When I grew up, the textbooks were English. When my children grew up, they were Caribbean. Mr. Bodden has the ability to write. But you know, I heard one of the presenters mention yesterday that some time ago many, many years ago, they had put together a series of books that was supposed to be used to teach the school to disseminate information, particularly to primary school children, concerning the island. Well, that book was outdated about a year later, and it has never been updated. Those books were outdated. It has never been updated. We still have information in them that's maybe 20 years old. The Cayman Islands is growing. It's a young country. And, you know, sometimes we fail to understand that this country has grown in 50 to 60 years far more than developed countries like the United States has grown in 200 years. It's one of the problems we have faced. It's one of the reasons that the people got left behind, because we never thought that we needed to preserve these things. And then, of course, it wasn't very political to preserve them either. And now we're faced with this thing. Mr. Bodden, would he write a textbook? He hasn't been asked. As far as I know, the last time I talked to him, he's not been asked. There are many people in this community. We have artists who could contribute to the writing of such a book or such textbooks, telling our people about our people. We have 10 national heroes, and I would like to ask any high school student to name them for me and tell me their life story. We do it, we put it out there, we put the name, we do what I call, we create a facade. We put it out there like we're going to do something great, but it ends at the end of the ceremony. And our young people don't know, don't have these people in their minds that they can emulate. They don't. I'll tell you this before I finish. Some years ago, we were at a primary school putting on a display. And I said to one child, who was the education officer, and the education minister, and the 250 children in front of me looked at us with blank stares. And finally, one little boy put his hand up, and I said, yes, can you tell us who the education minister is? He said, Mr. Roy Borden. I said, Mr. Roy Borden, and who told you that? He said, my mama told me so. Because Mr. Roy Borden went to the schools when he was an education officer, and his mama had met Mr. Bodden as the education officer and knew who he was. If we don't get together and create that dialogue with our children, they are going to be another lost generation in this country.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much, Dr. Lawrence. And now to our next speaker via Zoom.
Are you ready now? I can go ahead? Can you hear me? Okay, good morning. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, especially to Mr. Roy Borden. What I'm trying to present here probably needed about an hour, but probably that applies to everybody out there. But I should mention as I begin that coming after the venerable Mrs. Mary Lawrence is of course a challenge, but in a sense, she has made it easier for me because some of what I want to cover in the first part of my talk, she has already covered. So I'm very, very grateful for that. I understand that this lecture, the event is going to be an annual event. I would have loved, of course, to see a little more of the people that I hear on radio talk shows, you know. Maybe one or two of them could also come to present, but of course, that's something that can be considered in due course. Let me very quickly give a shout out. I always love to give a shout out to the young people. Latoya Francis, who presented yesterday. By the way, I listened to all papers, you know, from yesterday to this day. Catherine Wells, Mikana Scott, and a very, very special shout out to my former neighbor, Kathy Gomez, who turned a tragedy into something helping the community. That was very touching to watch. But of course, all the papers have been very good. Now, I have prepared a paper, which I'm sure will be available at some point, but if there's going to be a book, which I've heard about, I would want, of course, to revise that a little bit. Now, let me call what I have called an anecdotal digression, although it's not a digression really. It's about how I met Roy Borden. I came to Cayman in August of 2003 to work as a legislative counsel. And I was introduced to him at the old Kirk House. Parliament was sitting there, Legislative Assembly was sitting temporarily there for a while. And when I was introduced to him, he said, well, welcome to the Cayman Islands. And then he said, in his inimitable style, he said, well, I understand you'll be working on my employment bill. I said, yes, sir. And he said, well, this is like a baptism of fire. You know, that's the best Roy Borden I can do, you know. And the reason he said that was because the bill was controversial. It was going to be very good for people working in Cayman, but it was also very controversial. And because of that, it has never come into force. Now, I should also add here that my big daughter is a great admirer of Mr. Borden as well. Now, regarding Mr. Borden's work. Now, just about every time I listen to Roy Borden speak, call into a talk show, or watch him on a show, it reminds me of the first time that I went to university. My first degree was back in a university deep in Southern Africa, the University of Zambia. And in those days, what they told us, and this is very relevant also to what Mrs. Lawrence has been talking about. They told us at that time we only had one university, they've got 32 now. And they said, we don't want you to leave this university indoctrinated in ideas that don't suit you. We want to teach you to think, but we also want to teach you to understand your context. They told us that when you go out there, there is an ideological war. There are people out there who will tell you that if you do things this way, it's good for everybody, but it's not good for everybody. It's only good for them. And you need to be able to decipher those kind of misrepresentations. As a result, they made a rule that regardless of the subject that you were studying, the course, whether it was engineering, medicine, or whatever, you had to do a course called African Studies. Now, African Studies wasn't really African Studies. It was oppressed people's studies, really. If I was naming the course, that's what I would have named it. Because we studied the American Civil Rights Movement. We read, for example, James Baldwin's Go Tell It on the Mountain, Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, Kwame Nkrumah's Neo-Colonialism. He taught us that you should always be careful, even when you go to church. Sometimes the sermon you are listening to has not been crafted by the preacher who is preaching. It might be crafted by some indoctrinologist who is also a political scientist who try and make certain ideas grow. We read V.S. Naipaul's The Suffrage of Elvira. Malcolm X's autobiography, which was written with Alex Haley, who later wrote Roots, the miniseries starring LeVar Burton and John Amos. We read George Jackson. George Jackson was a young man who was associated with Angela Davis at the time, and he went to jail, and he wrote these letters which were so well written, and they were published under the title Solidar Brother. And of course, we read the works of Martin Luther King. The idea was to ensure that we have a sense of self, but at the same time, we were not indoctrinated. Now, coming to the work of Dr. Borden, I read his first one, The Cayman Islands Society in Transition. I read it cover to cover at the time when it came out. I also read Patronage and Politics, which came out later. I also read that one cover to cover. Now, in the first book in particular, by the way, I recommend both of them to anybody who is coming to the Cayman Islands. They are a very good introduction to the Cayman Islands and very readable. He's talked about the Eurobank trial, the land tenure system, and I believe when he wrote an article regarding the land tenure system, he had to pay a price, which you've heard about a little bit, because people didn't like it. And yet today in Cayman, one of the things which is being spoken about more than anything else is the land tenure system. How much better, perhaps, might have successive governments managed that if they had listened at the time. He speaks also about the need to blend the old Cayman and the new Cayman in a way that does not sacrifice one on the altar of the other. He spoke also about the need for consciousness in schools, which we have also heard about. It is too late when kids leave school for you to try and teach them about international politics and their role in it. They have to learn it in school before they start even thinking. Then he said something also in the book about legislation. At that time, his employment law was delayed a little bit because there was nobody to draft it. And then when I came, of course, I took it on. He wrote in the book about, he compared Cayman to Hong Kong and Singapore. And he looked at the drafting capacity, the capacity that each country had to write legislation. And he did that because these are competing jurisdictions. I mean, it's a book about history, but he was able to go deep even into that, and even talked a little bit about how some private law firms seem to almost boast that they can tell the government what to do. And when you look at what happened with the Legal Services Bill, you will know how deeply entrenched that problem is. And as I make my segue here towards judicial accountability, let me touch also another issue relating to legislation. When I came to Cayman, I was already an experienced legislative counsel. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Okay, I'll continue. Somebody sends me a message that I can go ahead. I'm not quite sure where I stopped, but I'll just go back just one little step there. Okay, I came to Cayman in 2003. That's when I came to Cayman. And I met Roy Borden and I worked on his employment law. Let me just, I know you have missed some of what I have said, but I'll have to go on because I have to keep within my time. Within my time. Let me go on, just move on to the last thing I wanted to say about legislation. Okay, somebody gives me a message about where I stopped. It wasn't too far back. It wasn't too far back. So I'll pick up from that point. You see, so when Roy Borden spoke about those issues about legislation and so on, and how government sometimes is just practically told what to do. And by the way, I can tell you that even some of the meetings to write certain legislation is held in private law firms. I can tell you that because I have been there. Okay. Now, before I move into the judicial accountability, let me talk about the contribution I tried to make, having been very grateful to have been given an opportunity to work in Cayman. I developed a course which went with a little book, a published book, some materials, some of them published by me, as well as a PowerPoint presentation. I said this is a one-day course to empower Caymanians, let them understand how you craft legislative proposals so that you can control the content and you can form an optimum partnership with the persons who are writing legislation. After I designed that course, I put it to the government, the Attorney General and my then head of department, and they said, no, you are not going to teach this in Cayman. I said, but this is done in other countries, and this is going to be my contribution. I'm not demanding any extra money for it. I will do it as part of my job. They said, no, you are not going to do this. The chief officers approved that this is something they wanted to do. Two people, the Attorney General and the Premier at the time, said, no, you are not going to teach this. And of course, you know why they were saying that. They didn't want Caymanians to be smart, to know how to control the content of legislation. At that time, I was so disappointed. I appealed to the Civil Service Appeals Commission. It wasn't successful. Finally, I went to court. I sought a judicial review. And what the Attorney General and the Premier did at that time, you need to listen to this. They hired a Queen's Counsel and a senior lawyer to come to court, and they spent $79,000 United States dollars. $79,000 United States dollars. For what reason? So that they can come to court to argue that I should not be allowed to teach that little course, just to share with Caymanians as to how to make legislative proposals. I lost the case, of course, because I think the judge was specifically assigned to that case, but that's another discussion for another day. So that's the problem in Cayman. In Cayman, you elect a government, and this has been touched upon, and then you have to fight them to do that which you elected them to do while they are trying to keep you ignorant. Now, let me get to the judicial accountability. I'm not even quite sure where I am with my minutes. I imagine I'm about halfway through. In Cayman, there is a problem with judicial accountability. I will tell you what the problem is and how to fix it. If you've got a problem with a judge who you think has misconducted themselves, not just made a decision you don't like, but has misconducted themselves in relation to a case. In the 2009 Constitution, what would happen is that you would apply to the Judicial and Legal Services Commission, and they would look at what happened. Actually, they heard about 9 cases at the time, although we don't know what actually the result was. But somebody in the judiciary was unhappy. They said, what we are going to do is we are going to amend the Constitution. So the Constitution was amended 2016. Now, if you are unhappy with what a judge has done, you go to the Chief Justice for Grand Court judges, and you go to the President of the Court of Appeal for Court of Appeal judges. You tell me whether that can ever be effective. These are people there having drinks together with over the weekend. There's no way that one institution can police itself, and it's nowhere done like that in the Commonwealth. And how did I get the inspiration to write on that? It's because of my own case, which is going on right now. Now, I know it is sub judice, but it was in open court, as well as the writ is on the judicial website. It's on the open part of it. Anybody can read it. Basically, I was denied a right to a hearing by a judge. Rather than give me the 2 days he had originally said that he was going to give me, he wrote in his judgment, well, I denied him a hearing. 5 minutes, thank you. The judge said, well, I denied him a hearing, and the reason I denied him a hearing was because he requested it very late. Now, let me tell you this and give it to you in black and white. The judge was lying. How do I know he was lying? Because there were 12 emails to 8 parties which showed that I requested it 8 weeks in advance. But his idea was to ensure that I do not get a chance to be heard because he was planning to decide against me anyway. And then I cited to him 52 cases, okay? I cited to him 52 cases. And you know how many cases he mentioned in his judgment? Not one of the 52 cases that I cited. He didn't mention them. And then on top of that, he lies about it again. And he says, well, he never submitted anything of substance. He just made some broad general statements, which was not true. Now, there were some other lies he told, but I won't get into that. By the way, the judge is Mr. Justice Ian Kawali. So we left it there. And basically, I am now in the Grand Court. The governor has refused to do anything about it. The Chief Justice has refused to do anything about it. In fact, now, the governor have applied that they want my matter to be struck out. First of all, the governor said he was very concerned about what this judge had done. But then when I took it to court, then they say, well, it should be struck out. It should not even be heard. And also there should be a special order against me not to bring any other case again. And what did the personal assistant to the judge say? Did the personal assistant say, no, Mr. Simamba is lying? No. The personal assistant just said in her filing, I was just doing what I was told. So she knows that the judge is lying. Okay? So what are my recommendations? My recommendations are that appointment of judges, judicial officers should be subject to the approval of Parliament. There should be targets. There's the targets for Caymanians being appointed to positions on the bench. West Bay Road would never have been closed if you had the right judges who had the right sensibilities. The complaint procedures against judges need to be revamped so that they can be improved. And also we need to know who is complained against. In Ontario right now, there's a judge who, after they established a prima facie case against him, the case was even being streamed. We could listen to it, but in Cayman, we don't do that. There's also need for all proceedings in Cayman to be recorded. Now, I imagine I've got about 1 minute. Let me just wind up. I think appointment of the Attorney General as well needs to be subject to the approval of the Legislative Assembly. The Attorney General has been notorious for changing legal advice. He changed legal advice in relation to TILEPs, tempura. He has violated tender procedures. He has taken to court cases he should never have taken to court, like Dr. McLaughlin's case, like the Doctors Express case, over which I think a number of people should retire. In fact, in my personal opinion, the Attorney General should resign for what he did to those people who were investing in Doctors Express. The DPP, not as many problems there, but also there is need for criteria for prosecution and a certain supervisory mechanism. There's a very nice article which was at CNS which covered this, and I recommend it. It's mentioned in my paper there. So in conclusion, at the risk of having stolen a minute, I hope that this forum does give further impetus to the need to sensitize the community to Roy Borden's work and its enhanced relevance to addressing issues in the Caymanian society here today. I thank you very much.
Good morning. Can I ask everybody who, anyone who has a phone on, please silence it. I think we're getting some problems. As Billy was speaking, and even as Ms. Lawrence was speaking and listening to all of the papers yesterday, I actually was smiling to myself quite a lot. If I can just get my phone. I was smiling because I remember a Shakespeare quotation, and I must give you this. It says, "How many ages hence shall this be our lofty scene, shall this our lofty scene be acted over in states unborn and accents yet unknown?" I hope that, I think it's very simple and very easy to understand that this exercise that we are going through has been going on since time immemorial, and it has been going on in the Caribbean. And my luck is that I'm old enough and have grown up in a Caribbean that was colonial. I come from British Guyana, and it was colonial. And I lived through the time as a young man to see the Constitution suspended when patriotic men and women, men like Roy Borden, got together to ask for self-government. These things have been going on for a very long time, and while we may think that they're changing, deep down under the surface, as Billy was explaining, there is always that wave that is ready to take you away. So I'm gonna, this paper essentially, I'm gonna cast Roy Borden in the guise of more than just a historian or someone who's telling us or teaching us about Caymanian history, but as an artist, and I'll read now. So I start off here with a quote from Nobel laureate Derek Walcott. I, with legs crossed along the daylight, watched the variegated fists of clouds gather over the uncouth features of this my prone island. My reading of Roy Borden's work and what I know of him from our discussion leads me to see him through the eyes of a creative. His work and life carry the vibratory rate of a universal intellect. It combines deep, incisive, and prolific thought. Listen carefully, and you will hear his thoughts humming to the passionate pitch of Mr. Radley's fiddle. He betrays an overwhelming passion for revealing what we have hidden behind the breadfruit tree. Through a narrative of personal experiences of racism, prejudice, classism, duplicity, denigration, and denial, he speaks from experience, and his words sing to us like those of Calypsonian Dr. Hollis Liverpool, who is better known as Chalk Dust, who says, "The price of liberty, please realize, is eternal vigilance." Bodden understood that his true calling was, as the Barbadian poet Bruce St. John says, to paint the nation and let the chips fall where they may. Like Bodden, I grew up in a tenement yard in a British colony in a place called Allboystown, in what was, of course, British Guyana. I was born without a father. He, as the English would say, had buggered off on the first Windrush boat, bound for Britain in June 1948, 6 months before I popped out. I never knew him until the age of 27, when I arrived in London to go to university. And when I met him, we could only be friends, and we remained good friends until he passed away, and I held nothing against him. He joined the Royal Air Force, and his life went in a different direction from mine. So I have long thought that the writer, the title writer, cannot contain Roy Borden. His work and life is more expansive. He's an artist, an intellectual, and I want to stick this in there and I hope we get it. He's a freedom fighter. And as an aside, I have often wondered, why is it that only people who kill with guns are called freedom fighters, while artists who shoot people with flowers are not? As it specifically refers to art and the artist, my contribution this morning considers generally how artists, including Roy Borden and at least one other Caymanian, have been engaged in the torturous, continuing struggle for freedom, independence, and emancipation from mental slavery. I will look at the tenement yard as the incubator of our great artists, as the tenement yard as home, as identity, as self. And I will try to talk about the heroic and visionary works artists have done to chant down Babylon, as Bob Marley exhorts exhorts us to do. Not to burn it down with fire, but to chant it down with music, with art. As Marley says, music, you're the key. Music, you're the key. Talk to me. Please talk to me. Bring the voice of the Rastaman communicating to everyone. I know, I know, I know. Reggae music. You can put any kind of music to that. The point there is that art is one way of chanting down Babylon. And Babylon is any system that oppresses other people. It is not a race or a color or a creed. It is any system that oppresses people. Or, as David Rudder does in his classic Calypso, Rally Around the West Indies, that asks us to remember and honor our heroes and hold our heads high even when we are at our lowest ebb. No noble cause, quote, no noble cause brought us here to these islands, but through it all we have risen above. Through our flannelled nights flashing the willow and leather, these keepers of our flame must feel our undying love. Roy Borden is a keeper of the Caymanian flame. If he did not exist, sooner or later, Caymanians in search of a mind emancipated from mental slavery would seek to invent him. So they will one day do with another artist living among us, Dr. Frank McField. But we shall leave Dr. Frank's prescient works for another time when he is the subject of interrogation. Since Ormond Panton and William Warren Connolly rocked the good ship Cayman in 1962 and altered these islands' course, only a small number of politicians, social commentators, and others in the public eye have felt driven or had the courage to speak directly or metaphorically about the critical issues I itemized earlier. It appears to me that many of us have been standing for a long time, staring in childlike amazement down the proverbial fork in Robert Frost Road, unwilling or unable to take the path less traveled. Both paths were strewn, beg your pardon, I'll start that again. Bodden looked down both roads, or both paths, and contemplated for a while. Both were strewn with the detritus of a colonial existence and his mostly missing father. They were strewn with neglect, machinations, denigration, platitudes, and attitudes of superiority. One path led to a reasonably decent material existence if Bodden was willing to compromise his integrity and squander his dream of fulfilling himself and enlightening his people. The other path would require tremendous courage and sacrifice to grope his way through the darkness of inequality, disrespect, betrayal, and neglect. Bodden chose the latter path, refusing, in his own words, to beg favors from those, quote, whom I held in contempt. This choice made all the difference. With bold and determined steps, he found his way. Out of that experience, he was able to offer us works as mirror, very much like Cassius does with Brutus in William Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. Quote, since you cannot see yourself so well as by reflection, I, your glass, will modestly discover to yourself that of yourself which you yet know not of. Indeed, like the great Indian poet and mystic Rabindranath Tagore, Bodden must have appreciated that, quote, the one who plants trees, knowing that he will never sit in their shade, has started to understand the meaning of life. In his foreword to the 1963 publication, The Artist in West Indian Society, the eminent Jamaican educator and novelist John Hearn, who Mr. Bodden would have met probably when he was at MICO, he said, the true story of the West Indian artist for the past generation, and any generation as far as I'm concerned, is a record of the anguished attempts to make our landscape symbolically significant. Today, nearly 60 years after Hearn's statement, and most Caribbean countries having achieved independence, our artists' anguished attempts to symbolically signify our landscape have not diminished, and their true story of struggle against inequality, disrespect, and neglect by the people and systems working against them continues. These people are, by and large, our own, and many of the systems are of our own making. As the mighty chalk dust, the Calypsonian Dr. Hollis Liverpool would ask his audience rhetorically, a lie? We seem to have forgotten or choose to ignore the fact that but for the work of artists and public intellectuals like Roy Borden, C.L.R. James, Frank McField, Leonard Dilbert, Marcus Garvey, George Lamming, to name just a few, that our societies would still be groping in the dark, in a dark cavern of self-loathing. Even in the face of global approbation of creative geniuses like Bob Marley, Peter Tosh, Derek Walcott, Kamau Brathwaite, Mighty Sparrow, Lord Kitchener, you name them, regional governments appear reluctant to provide the necessary support and freedom that will allow artists to interpret their societies without being ostracized, starved, or shunned. Those who hold power by whatever means they get it are bent on holding on to it. And it is an established fact that artists can be dangerous to those who abuse power. This is not unique to the Caribbean. The celebrated Greek philosopher Plato feared that artists would upturn the social and political order he championed in the name of democracy. He declaring that poets were not writing the kind of poetry the kind of poetry he liked. He banned creative writers, even the ones who we now hold as the greatest of Greek playwrights and poets. He banned them from his ideal republic. He banned Homer, the poet who wrote two of history's enduring epics of heroism, the Iliad and the Odyssey. He banned Sophocles, the tragic playwright, author of more than 100 plays, including Oedipus Rex, Oedipus the King, and Oedipus at Colonus. He banned Euripides, another tragedian, whose verse plays include Medea, the Trojan woman, and the Bacchae. He banned Aristophanes, the genius of Greek comedy, whose works include the clouds, the wasps, the birds, the frogs, and Lysistrata. Plato wanted nothing to do with artists and thinkers who create much of the cultural literature upon which Western theater practice and philosophy is built. The story is no different in the Caribbean, and it is not much different in the Cayman Islands. And it is only significantly less different in the Cayman Islands. The British novelist Jeanette Winterson summarizes the attitude. We are a weird people. We make it as difficult as possible for our artists to work honestly while they live. Either we refuse them money, or we ruin them with unhelpful praise, or wound them with unhelpful blame. And when they are too old, or too dead, or too beyond dispute to hinder anymore, we canonize them so that what was wild is tamed, what was objecting becomes authority. Artists have always had the burden to justify their existence and why they should receive state sponsorship or state funding. They have to bare their souls and feel humiliated and thankful like a beggar at a corner. We seem not to know or care that many of the works we revere as great art were made through the generosity of patronage. Michelangelo's patrons included the Medici, Lodovico and Lodovico Sforza, and Caesar Borgia. Rembrandt had Huygens. Van Gogh was supported financially during his entire life by his brother Theo. These artists created countless masterpieces of art, including Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel and Rembrandt's Night Watch, which are used to define Western aesthetic and civilization. Yet we, in Cayman and the Caribbean region, find it difficult, if not impossible, to see how commissioning a piece of art from any of the artists we speak so glowingly of is going to help Cayman in its quest for identity. Instead of supporting our artists with commissions, we purchase cheap commercial prints, many of them the artists never receive any commission on, that have absolutely no meaning or connection to the culture, and hang them on the walls of our offices. We do not read the books published, including the works of the man we celebrate here today. Then we lament about how other people are taking our culture. But I shall resist the temptation of going on a rant. Let me tell you a little bit about art. Art educates. This is Dr. Frank McField in his playground. Quote, talking is one thing, sailing boats is another, and building them is yet another. It takes a lot to make from pieces of lumber a seaworthy boat or a schooner. You got any idea how hateful that sea could be when it wants to be? It could be calm 1 minute, calm as daylight, and the next minute a dead rough storm takes down on you, and you feel like you will drown. It starts with a wave or two attacking you, bang, bang, up against the bow. And they come time and time again. But the seaworthy boat don't allow the banging to turn her back. She might pitch and rock and roll, swing and sway, but she would never make that banging turn her back. The good boat, she goes down and up with the sea, always pitching forward where she's going. When the waves see this, they begin to gang up on her. Talking to themselves, they gang up on her. Now, as far as you could see them, waves are swallowing themselves, rolling over and over together. Then they come out from planning. And it's not one or two or three, but plenty, 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 all rushing one time, bang, bang. They lick her, they kick her on one side, and in her belly, fast, fast, like I was showing you. She bow, she grunt, and she groan. She bawl and she moan. It's like her belly tearing asunder. But it don't happen. She don't break. Instead, she just come up back and slap the sea, box the waves, kick the water, comes up for a split second, so the waves could gang up again. And so this go on and on and on, hours, days, and weeks. And I'm not going to give you all the rest of this stuff, but I'll tell you about art. Art is a way of seeing and interpreting the beauty of the world. I won't read Vincent van Gogh's piece for you. Art is concerned with the condition of humanity in and beyond the physical. In the play No Exit by Jean-Paul Sartre, 3 people are locked in a room. They believe it to be hell, but no one arrives to torture them, so they talk with each other. They're forced to talk with each other. They discuss each other's lives and actions and realize in the end that they are there to torture each other. Art gives us something to live for. It is evident in the rites and rituals of every society and art, including the epic religious festivals, Ram Leela, Kumbh Mela of India, the Hajj of Mecca, the medieval mystery cycles of England, the Gelede spectacle of masquerade spectacle of Nigeria, and in Cayman, our boat launches, sanding yards, and the John canoe at Bodden Town at Christmas. These traditions reclaim the past, are attentive to the present, and open doors to preparation for time beyond time. Art objects. Bob Marley's poetic imagery and interrogation of deprivation, inequalities, and the curse of Babylon's system subverted the pristine tourist image of Jamaica as playground. And because of this, and the work of other artists, like Nasario Suku, who brought back Long Celia as hero, the image of Babylon's system, or Shitsem, as a blood-sucking vampire, is understood not only in Jamaica, but in Cayman and the rest of the Caribbean and the world over. This is long. I'm going to stop there, but we will have it, and hopefully all these papers from the conference will be published in one booklet later. Thank you very much. If anyone has questions, I'd be happy to take questions. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Hi, Mr. Matu. I have a question.
Go ahead.
I've noticed that over the years, there's a lot of cultural influences from other countries. There's a lot of discussion around how Caymanians can embrace our culture and share it. Obviously, there's going to plays, there's supporting the arts. What is your opinion on why we as Caymanians, who know our culture because we do live it, don't seem to be able to embrace it or share it in a way that's meaningful to our families and to the people who come from other countries to live here? And why do you think that people that come from other countries sometimes appear to not truly want to get to know our culture as Caymanians?
Well, culture really is the only thing we have. If you really look at it, it's the only thing, it's what makes us. Everything that we do, every single thing that we do makes us. And if we are educated from when we are very young, and if we are not engaged with the people, you see, Miss Mary talks a lot about that this morning, and everybody mentioned this in many ways. If you're not engaged from very early, and this means if your education system is not upturned from the ones that you knew, and if your books are not changed, then it's going to always be difficult. The children has to learn this from their young children in school. The curriculum has to be designed in such a way that you're told this. And you see, when we published Dr. Frank's book and Roy's book, when we did Stories My Grandfather Never Told Me, and when we published Frank's plays, 2 plays, Downside Up and Time Longer Than Rope, the whole idea was to get these books into schools, not just as a means of teaching plays or teaching about anything in particular, but the culture. If you know those plays, the culture is there. And I've always been a little accusatory of people who, you see, people don't know. Let me talk a little bit about the foundation to try to answer your question. People don't really know, I'm sorry to say, what we do in this organization. How many people know that we, and we took a cue actually from the Northwest, which Miss Mary worked with, because we knew it had gone, and then there was New Star. And we published a journal called Foundation, the Arts and Culture Journal of the Cayman Islands. We couldn't continue it because we just couldn't get the funding to do it, right? And so, but how many people know we have 5, I think, volumes? One is a double volume. How many people have read any of those articles? Interview by Mr. Bodden, interview with young Caymanian artists. How many people know them? How many people know, for example, that the Cultural Foundation, when we decided that Mr. Radley was important and Aunt Julie was important, and we recorded them and put their music out, how many people have listened to the music except when you hear it on the radio? We set about doing these things because I knew, as the artistic director, and the board knew this also, that we had to make certain that if this place alone takes on the responsibility of teaching Caymanians through art what the value of their culture means to them, then that would be all that we need to do. For example, how many people in Cayman, Caymanians, have gone to Miss Lassie's house and walked in the house and taken a tour to listen to who this woman is, because her works keep her alive, who she is, what has she done. Most people know her through their parents, you know. She was an old, you say, who was Miss Lassie? She was an old woman who cursed and whatever she did. How many people know? When you sat and you spoke with her, you knew that she was human. She had all the failings of a human being, but she had all the graces of an angel. When you look at her and when you study her work, you will see that the culture of the Cayman Islands is embedded in that work. The privations and the suffering that she went through with 4 of her brothers being drowned at sea, one of her brothers being burnt to death. Could you imagine when someone goes to see, well, some of you can, the older Caymanians, your family goes to see somebody from the community and they come back. And there's no closure, because all you're told is that we're so sorry to report to you that the ship, got into a storm or it sank off of Canada or wherever. But there's no closure. So having gone through that, when you look at the paintings, and we're doing a book on her again, it's not just that she painted these things up from the Bible. What she did is every story that she painted that was biblical had something to do with her life. And it tied in the spiritual, right, with her real actual life. So I think if it starts from the school, for example, the work that the Cultural Foundation does, we are not the Department of Education. We cannot take on educating Cayman in the way that the Ministry of Education and the people who create our curriculum, we can't take that on. When people come to us, they're already coming to us when it's almost impossible to change their thinking. We can influence them, obviously, and depending on their own self-confidence out of their environment from which they came, we'll be able to help them in terms of understanding. But it's really very difficult. And so and so the unique thing about Cayman with other people coming and we are knowing other people's culture, the thing about human beings, is that we are not, we have to be able to stand and build a foundation on our own foot, so that the people from any part of the Caribbean or Caymanians would be able to stand up firm in the soil of their knowledge and say, I am Caymanian. But it must not be that you don't know or understand or appreciate the world. Because, again, this is a quotation I gave before, and I'm going to try to, I don't know if I'll get it right. It's a quotation from Gandhi, who said that, I want the winds of the world to blow through my house, but I refuse to be blown off my feet. And I think that's the attitude I take. I'm a proud Caribbean. I'm a proud Caymanian now, although I know I can never be the same type of Caymanian as Miss Mary is. But it's my home, and everything I do is designed to make it a better place for everybody, including all the Caymanians, first and foremost, who live here. So it's always going to be difficult, but we have to call on our legislators and a new government that has promised much, and we have to hold them accountable, not just listen to the words that we are going to keep hearing over and over, but hold them accountable. Thank you.
I'm so sorry, we can't accommodate any more questions for this session, but of course, both Dr. Mary Lawrence and Dr. Mutu will be here for the rest of the day. We're about to go into a 5-minute coffee break. I really want to invite you to please go ahead and have a talk with them during that period. So we're going to take a very quick break because the next panel is due to come on. 5 minutes, please, and then we will resume. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, may I invite you all to please take your seats so we might resume. Good girl. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us again for this, our second panel of day 2. We're having some interesting conversations here at the Harquail Theatre, and I do want to remind those of you who might be viewing online, though we really appreciate you joining us via that forum, please feel free to come on down to the Harquail Theatre, where we're having some really wonderful and stimulating discussions, and we wait to welcome you. So we are going into the second round of presentations for today, and I'm very happy to, as usual, introduce the members of the panel. And of course, as has been the case, we are going to invite our speakers to come up in the order in which they have been introduced. Quite interestingly, I have the honor of introducing myself, as I'm going to be your next speaker. I am, of course, Dr. Stephanie Fullerton Cooper, Associate Professor of Language and Literature in the Arts and Humanities Faculty at the University College of the Cayman Islands, and my title will be Mirrors and Reflections, Seeing Cayman Through Bodden's Short Stories and Poems. Our next speaker will be Mr. Mario Ebanks, Senior HR Strategic Consultant at the Premier Solutions Group, Independent Director, and Policy Analyst. His topic will be Reform of the Labor and Human Capital Development Framework and Systems in the Cayman Islands. Mrs. Lorraine Bob Stewart will follow. She's an academic advisor at the University College of the Cayman Islands, was a former adjunct lecturer at that institution, and is currently a doctoral candidate. Her topic, Using Migration Theories to Understand Jamaican and Caribbean Peoples' Migration to Cayman. And we have a slight change from what's on the program. Our final speaker today will be Mrs. Laura Panades. She is a Truman Bodden Law School lecturer and course leader of the LLM program. She's an expert in public-private partnerships, and she's also pursuing a PhD in law. Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for our panel, please. And so I will begin with my presentation. Let me just make sure this is fine. Yes. So today I'm talking about mirrors and reflections. And of course, mirrors and reflections are seemingly simple concepts which take on tremendous implications, however, when expressed as a literary trope. Think literally when I say that mirrors replicate, they represent and represent. Mirrors deflect, they enhance, reduce, or augment. They seduce, authenticate, and distort. Now think of the metaphorical implications. When I express the ideology that Bodden's writings are a mirror of the Cayman society, that his writings replicate, represent, and represent, deflect, enhance, reduce or augment, they seduce, authenticate, and yes, even distort. My paper is predicated on the theory that a prophet is never accepted in his own country. And although we have been talking for 2 days about Bodden and the poignancy of his works, there are still some naysayers out there, I believe, some who might believe that he is not perhaps deserving of the label public intellectual. I have had persons say to me in the past that Cayman does not produce writings and writers that are worthy of being added to the national curriculum. My proposal is that J.A. Roy Borden is Cayman's public intellectual, that he mirrors those authors and intellectuals who have been accepted as Caribbean giants in the concerns he expresses the themes he explores, and his continuous agitation for growth and change. Professor Nathan Crick attempts to outline the characteristics of a public intellectual and uses such words in defining them as having rhetorical ability, power of transformation, seminal contribution to an ordered community, philosophy and wisdom, intellectual acuity, charisma, historical treatments, alteration of an education system. Intellectuals who are thinkers, prolific writers on humanistic ideals, especially in fields of ethics, politics, theology, education, cultural history, literary criticism, linguistic studies, and rhetoric. Arguably, Borden does not meet all of these characteristics, many might say. But again, arguably, he meets most. He can be likened to writers from the Caribbean who have been canonized. That is, they produce highly valued writings that have achieved the status of classics, are revered as voices of intellectual contemplation, celebrated as social activists, known for their historical research, and are acknowledged as voices of significance and reference on many issues related to the Caribbean. It is they who become the wavelength against which other Caribbean writers are measured, and they are included here to highlight how closely Bodden's works and messages are aligned to their own. By exploring those works and highlighting their accomplishments, Bodden's place amongst other Caribbean historians, novelists, poets, and critics is established. To fully understand this, I take this exploration even further by examining not just writers from the Anglophone Caribbean, but those from the Hispanophone and Francophone as well. Jan Heinz John, German writer and influential scholar of literature, postulates, in reference to the Caribbean, that he, and I quote, knows of no other area of the world where so many important writers and poets are born in so small a population, to our credit. From the Anglophone Caribbean, renowned activist for regional writings, essayist and author, Barbados' George Lamming, establishes that the Caribbean now has a better perspective of the society as through its literature it has a better perspective of the society as, through its literature, it has been provided with a synoptic view of a whole civilization. He believes that storytelling, especially through the media of the novel and through theater, has enabled the Caribbean society to be returned to itself. The society has been called upon to look at itself. A country's ability to see itself reflected through its stories, as though looking at a mirror, enables it to correct any visible flaws, just like we do in front of a mirror daily, and construct new identities. Trinidad's literary critic and novelist, Merle Hodge, speaks of the cathartic function of the storyteller and views writers as image makers who are able to effectively agitate for change. One of the Caribbean's leading poets, and admittedly one of my favorites, St. Lucia's Derek Walcott, always speaks proudly of his love of country, often attesting that it is his home country that has inspired him and that defines who he is. Well, have you read Bodden's poetry? Have you read, for example, Ancestral Echoes? Have you read Tribute to the Seamen? Have you read Mia San Mia, where Bodden proudly and patriotically says, and I quote, "Did we not hail from Guardhouse, from Gun Square, from Scantron, from Granywell Road, from Macfield's Lane? Are we not Caymanians, descended from generations of those who came and from those who endured and survived? Warn them that we are not about giving up, that we will never surrender, that we will not be vanquished because, Mia San Mia, we are who we are." Even in his poem, Lament for the Land, where he does indeed lament, he does so out of love of country, lamenting for, and I quote, "the land laid bare, or lack of legislation, this land we inherited, or children, all that our fathers gave," end of quote. Erna Brodba, a Jamaican public intellectual, mirrors Bodden in that she too is a social historian, activist, novelist, and educator. She is said to give people their history as she took the messages of academia outside the enclave of her role as UWI professor in contention with students, and in 7 Second Sunday seminars taught her Woodside community in St. Mary, Jamaica, their history by tracing each family's genealogy back to its African ancestor. In doing so, she fosters a space for intellectual discourse where academia had no monopoly. Bodden similarly attempts to show Caymanians their history and first establishes his credentials to do so in his poem, The Poet, where he says, and I quote, "I am the poet, the griot, the prophet, the Akan poet of society, poet of Cayman." In the poem, Who Are You? Again, one of my favorites, he roots the Caymanian identity to a historical ancestry when he says, "You brought me here from way over there. You thought with me you would have no fear. I am a black man who fought with a spear. I am a black man, one from the rock, Africa's native son." From the Hispanophone Caribbean comes Cuba's revolutionary poet, Nicolas Guillen. Known for being outspoken and radical, he decries the Cuban people's oppression and was known as the influential national poet of Cuba. If one were to ask, is Roy Borden outspoken, radical, revolutionary, influential? I would answer, have you read his poetry? Have you read the appropriately titled Betrayal? Or the poem, Listen, Mr. Englishman, where the confrontational Bodden says, and I quote, "Listen, Mr. Englishman, I am no Oxford don. I never went to Cambridge either. I only born in Cayman. I didn't graduate, but neither did I migrate. Listen, Mr. Englishman, I am here to stay, and you will have to pay. I always know the way, so you're the one who has no say." Or have you read Mia San Mia, where Bodden says, "If this poem has any significance, it should serve to inform those who would appropriate our understanding, redefine our consciousness, deconstruct our sense of self. Warn them that we are not about giving up, that we will never surrender, that we will never be vanquished." Bodden mirrors Francophone authors like Simone Schwarzbart, who presents strong female characters in her novel here referenced, The Bridge of Beyond. Strong women like Tellume Miracle, Messiah, and Queen Without a Name, and pays tribute to and celebrates the exceptional woman who understands adverse elements. Bodden likewise pays homage to the survival power of Cayman women. In his short story, How Pearlie Lost Her False Teeth, we meet mothers who will stop at nothing to ensure their daughters have a better future than they did. In another short story, The Death of Artemitra Johnson, we meet the octogenarian protagonist who, in face of difficulty and great challenge, withstands greater powers than herself, holding her head high and holding to her beliefs. So, life bangs and thumps Bodden's Cayman women, but like Schwarzbart, they keep the underside always intact. Self-preservation, isn't that true of Cayman's women? Should the author be viewed as the voice of its significance and reference on many intellectual issues related to the country and the wider Caribbean? Should storytellers help in the creation of an intellectual space to encourage and facilitate new lines of inquiry by the community, whereby ordinary citizens can study the stories and memories of their forefathers? Should a writer be seen as carrying on an important means of documenting and preserving a nation's history and culture, all of which are established by these canonized Anglophone, Hispanophone, and Francophone Caribbean authors? Why wouldn't Bodden, who reflects the Cayman Islands through the multiple stories he produces, who facilitates the nation's ongoing dialogues as reflected in writings that provide food for mature thought, introspection, and growth of the role of the storyteller, why would he not be deemed likewise? In his own words, Bodden posits that the role of the storyteller is critical to the development of even the most sophisticated societies. These are his words. He says, storytellers are informants, advisors, entertainers, curators of history and culture, keepers of the secrets. And the best storytellers are masters of hyperbole, embellishment, and exaggeration. If you listened closely to what he said, his voice says exactly the same, and yes, I do know that's tautology. I've deliberately put it in for emphasis. His voice says exactly the same as the authors and public intellectuals from the English-speaking, Spanish-speaking, and French-speaking Caribbean. Vis-a-vis, Roy Borden, public intellectual. Time does not allow me to fully explore the hypothesis of mirroring in different forms, especially as seen in continuity between the genres, because I think what distinguishes Bodden is that he writes a multiplicity of genres. In a nutshell, he is distinguished in that he has produced fiction and non-fiction, novels, essays, poetries, short stories. Various scholars have theorized that genres should remain separate, establishing and saying that the line of demarcation is fixed. Other scholars, however, have challenged the separation, establishing a continuum between genres. Undeniably, Bodden's fiction embodies and explains much of what is presented in his nonfiction. Mirroring is seen then in that his works show a continuity of thoughts, themes, and concerns despite genre. For example, in From Guardhouse to the Glass House, he outlines his journey through the maze of Cayman politics. He similarly explores politics in poems like Status Grant and One Man, One Vote. In Cayman Islands in Transition, he explores various social realities that transform the Cayman society, such as land ownership, the coming of investors, exploitation of the natives, and there are echoes of these in the embellished story, The Death of Artemisia Johnson, and in his poem, Lament for the Land. If I were to step a little bit away from mirroring and speak very briefly on reflections, I want to reiterate that Bodden's work reflects, that is, it represents and brings to the fore what the Cayman society grapples with daily. It transports a positive image of the Cayman Islands, challenges the outsider's perception of the islands, and invites rumination, reflection. When I first arrived in Cayman, for example, it was Bodden's works and other local writings that reflected for me such socioeconomic realities as the worth of land for the Caymanian. I did not understand the preoccupation with land until I went to his writings. It was these writings that represented for me the us versus them plurality, as well as xenophobia, that are so intimately tied up with identity. I see these in The Death of Artemisia Johnson. This short story also reflects Cayman's culture of omerta, or code of silence, as although many in the society know the identity of Artemisia's murderer in the story, they choose to remain silent. Very typical of a silent society that will not speak, and we've heard this in so many forms in the last 2 days, will not speak on some topics that might be uncomfortable. This story, Death of Artemisia Johnson, as well as the other short story, Out of A Gathering of Old Men, How Pearlie Lost Her False Teeth, reflect the themes of race, color, and class, Cayman's marriage and death traditions, and its religious heritage, even as it celebrates Cayman's Christian heritage, beautifully embodied in the short story characters like Tom Lijah, the village holy man. Black and white Cayman characters also find themselves seeking the advice of the village Obia man in East End. Bodden uses this idea of blacks and whites finding themselves in the same place to convey the idea that despite color, we in the Cayman Islands are more similar than we realize, as eventually we literally and metaphorically meet at the same place. We embrace the same beliefs, and we are exactly the same. Bodden's works affirm Cayman's culture, too often believed to be so diluted as to be non-existent. If there were no Cayman culture to be reflected, how then does he include proverbial expressions in his short stories like same knife, stick sheep, stick goat, and Everything good for eat, no good for talk. I met these in his writings. Local linguistic expressions like cookrum and caboose are words I first met because they were reflected in Bodden's works. His works reflect local beliefs and traditions like the old woman's ritual of preparing for bed, the powdering, the applying of perfume before going to bed, as we saw in The Death of Artemisia Johnson. It also reflects Pearlie's mother's advice that she drink senna tea in order to pass the false teeth she thought she had swallowed. And finally, Bodden's works reflect some of the haunting questions that the Cayman society asks today about land, birthright, status grant, national heroes, and yes, even questions about Mount Trashmore. He has a poem so titled. What doesn't Bodden reflect of the Cayman reality in his works? He mirrors what is outstanding about regional writings, and he reflects in his own works the idea that every little thing about the Cayman Islands, everything that Caymanians have overlooked and might have found wanting in themselves when they look in a mirror and examine their reflection, is actually worthy of falling on the pages of a book. Objects in the mirror are closer than they appear, literally and metaphorically. If Cayman could but see itself in Bodden's short stories and poems, I propose, it will find that it has enough stuff that is worthy of celebration. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Those here at the Harkwheel Theatre and those watching and observing by social media. I want to first of all thank the Cayman National Cultural Foundation, Dr. Livingston Smith, the organizing committee, and the CNCF and the Harkwheel staff for this opportunity and putting together this event. I also want to thank Dr. Livingston Smith. I don't see him here, actually. I don't see many people here because the light is so bright here, but I don't see him. But he is really a visionary and a world-class promoter of intellectual discourse and thought leadership. So I want to thank Dr. Livingston for being the force behind a lot of this work here today. Madam Moderator, ladies and gentlemen, the book authored by Dr. J. Roy Borden, I'm using as my reference today, for this paper is From the Guardhouse to the Glass House, One Man's Journey Through the Maze of Caymanian Politics. It's at the back for sale, and also I have it on the table there as well for emphasis. The topic that I am dealing with today, as we heard before, is reform of the labor and human capital development framework and systems in the Cayman Islands. Ladies and gentlemen, our mothers influence all of us. And in page 53 of Mr. Bodden's book, he speaks about the influence his mother had on his life of public service. Some of you may know that I lost my dear mother 3 weeks ago, and she was laid to rest this past Saturday. So the past 3 weeks has been very difficult, and it's only a miracle that I'm here today to present this paper. So although both of our mothers were not at all excited about our sojourns into the political arena, I know that Mr. Bodden's mother and my mother appreciated the importance of their sons engaging in public policy and intellectual discussions, come what may. So today I come here to deliver this short paper to demonstrate my respect for the work and life of Dr. Roy Borden and his writings, but also I do so in memory of my mother, Jeanette Betsy E. Banks, who I know is maybe now sitting on one of those great reviewing stands on that great eternal celestial shore. And I believe she's very pleased to see her youngest son sitting and standing with local and international scholars, researchers, and intellectuals, and discussing these topics that are crucial to nation building and positive growth, especially on this main stage here of our National Theatre. The connection of the topic that I just mentioned with Dr. Roy Borden. My first encounter with Dr. Roy Borden was in the 1970s at the then Cayman Islands High School, where he was a young teacher and I was a young student. It was a very brief encounter, but a good one. Since that time, I watched him transition from a teacher to a political activist, member of the Legislative Assembly, now the House of Parliament, a minister, the UCCI president, and now the president emeritus of UCCI. My encounters with Mr. Bodden throughout his life, whether it was in my various capacities, such as when I was a founder and past president of the Overseas Students Association in the mid-1980s, a founder of the Society of HR Professionals in the late 1990s, my service with him on the Education Council or on the UCCI Board of Governors or the ICCI Board of Trustees, my work in the ministry responsible for labor in the mid-1990s, or my service as president of Junior Achievement. My interactions with this gentleman, Dr. Roy Borden, has always been inspirational and intellectually stimulating. During his career, Mr. Bodden has not only been a dynamic orator, historian, and author, but he has been an authentic son of the soil, consistently advocating and fighting for Caymanian human capital development. I began to notice him more closely when I worked in the ministry responsible for labor in the mid-1990s. And even while he was on the opposition bench, he was nevertheless supportive. And there was a document that was subsequently aborted by the then government called Manpower Development Framework that the government was developing, but Mr. Roy and others continued to support that even as it died. It seems, though, that both of us at different levels during our life had a propensity to get into what U.S. Representative John Lewis called good trouble. That's another subject for another day. Dr. Bodden was also one of the strong proponents of the Labor Law 1984 that we heard about already today and yesterday. He was the minister responsible for education, human resources, and culture from 2000 to May 2005. And during that time, the Employment Bill 2004 was proposed and piloted through the Legislative Assembly by him, but only to be starved to death by the law not being brought into effect by the Governor and Council before and after the general elections 2005. Dr. Bodden's book of reference for this paper. As I mentioned previously, my book of choice for this paper is Guardhouse to the Glass House. In this discussion, and in this connection, amongst other parts of the book, on page 157, there's a discussion on the proposal for new employment relations in the Cayman Islands, as well as on the New Employment Relations Bill 2004. And on page 180 of that book, when writing about the Employment Bill 2004, Dr. Roy Borden said that his party colleagues had thrown him under the bus. So, my job today in this paper is to interrogate and interpret the hopes, goals, intentions, dreams, and visions that Mr. Bodden had for the area of human capital development, had he been allowed to serve for a further period in a senior policy-making role in that important and, may I say, neglected area. Just as a brief background, the case of reform. When we say human capital, what does it mean? A brief definition: human capital is that input into an enterprise or an economy that results in the development of tangible or intangible capital or assets. Human capital is valuable to an enterprise or to an economy as is financial and physical capital or assets. Human capital, therefore, is essentially a collective sum of attributes of life: experience, knowledge, soft skills, hard skills, energy, and enthusiasm that people choose to invest in an enterprise on a daily basis. The development and nurturing of human capital, ladies and gentlemen, is a strategic input for any well-governed jurisdiction or country, large or small. Furthermore, the international firm of Watson Wyatt launched a Human Capital Index study, which is now in its 20th year, which is the most comprehensive global study of the impact of human capital on business and which analyzes shareholder performance. The study produced several global findings, but there are just two I want to stress today. One, companies with superior human capital practices can more than double the shareholder value than companies with average human capital practices. And two, great human capital practices prevail regardless of economic conditions. In addition to this study, I have seen, and I'm also aware that Mr. Bodden has also seen, other studies which clearly point to the overwhelming positive business case which arises from a holistic and long-range investment in human capital and/or the adoption of best practices in human capital management. Evidence overwhelmingly confirms that investing in human capital is not only a national macroeconomic strategy, but also a wise microeconomic strategy for corporations. The return on investment is particularly dynamic when that investment in our country's DNA is done naturally rather than under compulsion. The rationale for reform and obstacles facing the existing institutional framework. In my view, which I share with Mr. Bodden, to allow continued sustainable growth, Caymanian succession planning and investment promotion, we must reform soon, and very soon, some of our human capital institutions. I feel that the current immigration or work, WORC, practices and procedures are an obsolete 1972 model which can no longer serve the needs of the Cayman Islands in the year 2021. The Caymanian Protection Law 1972 was the original legislation that got all this started. And over the years, there have been a number of superficial legislative amendments and administrative enhancements to immigration, and the most significant being in 2001 to 2003. A few years ago, the immigration legislation went through another overhaul, creating a transitional law, immigration transitional law, to recognize the restructuring of the Department of Immigration and establishing the new Workforce Opportunities and Residency Cayman, or work department. However, my friends, the struggle for sustained and justifiable, quantifiable progress benefiting all shareholders and stakeholders has been very challenging to date. So it is time for serious deficiency like this to be addressed if the dreams and visions and aspirations of Dr. Roy Borden are ever to be achieved, because the current operational maze will stifle the island's ability to compete in a dynamic regional and global service-oriented marketplace. The Cayman Islands, as we know, is a service economy. Our two main industries, financial services and tourism, together with its supporting sectors, can only survive if they can respond quickly to local, global customer expectations. With the increased pressures on the financial services sectors, such initiatives from places such as the FATF organizations, OECD, EU, and other large countries or trading blocs, essentially special interest groups, it is imperative to ensure the territory of the Cayman Islands has a critical mass of first-rate professionals, particularly Caymanians, to efficiently service current and long-term business opportunities. Pardon me. At the same time, young Caymanian intellectuals and professionals are becoming disillusioned, as we heard before, by our unbridled economic growth, especially when they are being marginalized in their career progression. Many college students and graduates are not being assimilated into suitable jobs in their fields, and experienced workers are becoming frustrated and demoralized due to the absence of best practices in human capital development, nationally or corporately, in some organizations, not all, but many. Some of these individuals are choosing not to return home once they complete university. And many others are talking about moving away from Cayman once they return or once they grow up. Such a brain drain could be very damaging, just like a military superpower which deliberately invests in its military might. The Cayman Islands as a service economy where skills, productivity, and efficiency are key inputs must continue to invest heavily in our Caymanian human capital if we are to become and remain a service economy superpower. Institutional reform. To make the vision and goals of Dr. Roy Borden a reality, I propose that it is high time to strategically and comprehensively revamp the structure of the Immigration/Work Department, its boards, its administrators' arrangements, as well as its established policies, procedures, and regulations or guidance notes governing a full sphere of operations. And my proposal then to do that involves a couple of things. Vision 2008, the National Strategic Plan, 1999-2008, which I have right here, and which is available for many years, realized that the remit of Immigration Department was too broad. And so that plan in Strategy 16, Action Plan 7 and 10 proposed a number of useful reforms. The first one, the amalgamation of the Labor Department and the Immigration Board into a new Human Resources Authority with an executive director and an industry-represented advisory board and a more transparent reporting arrangement. And two, formulation of a comprehensive training and succession planning policy applying to both the public and private sectors. To support this reform of the human capital framework and systems, it would be necessary to commission a comprehensive review by an independent provider or by a robust internal task force. The bulwark for this new framework and systems could be, in my opinion, should be a new Human Capital Development Law, or Act, as it's called now. This would be an amalgamation of the existing legislation that we have, immigration and labor, as well as some bespoke or unique provisions in laws and regulations. In interpreting and interrogating Dr. Bodden's goals in this area, I propose that the new Human Capital Development Authority would incorporate the Work Department, the Labor Department portion of the Department of Labor and Pensions, and the Scholarship Secretariat, which is now held within the Education Ministry. The authority would include the same or similar units or divisions as now exist in work, with other tweaking as necessary to accommodate the amalgamation of the Labor Department. The new law and structure would create a cohesive or joined up infrastructure and a policy hub for the restructured and fit-for-purpose entity, a Human Capital Development Authority, which will be supported by robust IT automation, e-government platforms, and good customer service. Another broad area of reform and alignment of the Human Capital Development Framework lies in the audit and accountability systems. Seeing that Dr. Roy Borden is an advocate of the learning organization, evidenced by his career, parliamentary and ministerial and academic support for such programs as Investors in People, TVET, and Italic Learning, for example, I feel that the proposed employer accreditation system could be used by the Human Capital Development Authority as a central tool to create a culture of compliance. And this will be a catalyst for building stakeholders' accountability, clarity, and buy-in. And that tool does not have to be developed. It already exists. The big fat document right here that I have that has been around for a while, but also collecting dust. The final area to briefly mention in relation to human capital development is the indirect but related constituency of the Cayman Islands education system. This must be also aligned with the tertiary education system and the workplace human capital and career succession planning frameworks. For the education system, the following very brief policy and operational areas must also be agile and functioning, otherwise the upward pipeline for human capital will also be compromised. So 1, scholarship administration should be aligned. Discipline and order in our schools. 2, early childhood education and special education needs. 3, 4, detection and testing for early learning disabilities. 5, examining of the merits of cultural and nationalities integration or cross-pollination in our schools. And finally, 6, in summary, promotion of parental involvement. It's perhaps one of the most important parts that we've got to get right. There is a part 2 to this paper dealing with reforms to the labor law, which much of which was included in the Labor Relations Bill 2015, when I was Director of Labor and when the Honorable Tara Rivers was Minister responsible for labor. There are also a number of effective and immediate short-term reforms which can be made, for example, to the labor tribunals and the labor appeals tribunals' operations and functions and governance. There's also another rich package or menu of companion initiatives which can be pursued to further strengthen the area of human capital development in these islands. But time does not allow me to deal with these policy matters today, but this material can be discussed in the next symposium or at public intellectual discourses in the near future. I will, however, am compelled to, however, mention one area which we heard this morning and we heard yesterday, that is a mandatory culture and history awareness / sensitivity and orientation for all expatriate workers entering the Cayman Islands for the first time. When I was Director of Labor between 2012 and 2015, I did have some discussions with Dr. Henry Matu on this program, but policy and resources prevented us from implementing it. But after hearing Reverend Sylvia Wilkes speak yesterday at this symposium about global leadership agility, I think it is high time for such a program to become reality in the global melting pot, which is the Cayman Islands. And in conclusion, Madam Moderator, just for another 60 seconds, I want to draw your attention to page 198 of my reference book, Mr. Borden's From the Guardhouse to the Glass House, where the author encapsulates a footnote which warns of future or further neglect of the labor and immigration challenges as follows. If the problem associated with labor and immigration, and I quote, are not satisfactorily settled within the next decade, then Cayman society will suffer violent social upheaval akin to that experienced in other Caribbean societies in the 1930s, close quote. Ladies and gentlemen, we have been discussing this topic, which started as immigration reform for the past 30 years. At the present time, we are still operating a new work department without a full set of policies or directives or vision. And added to that, we are still operating under the immigration transition law and regulations. But my friends, ladies and gentlemen, here and around the world, how long will the Cayman Islands be in this holding pattern before we get a new proper law such as the Human Capital Development Act? How long? Madam Moderator, ladies and gentlemen, in considering human capital challenges and opportunities to our island's economic growth and long-term nation building, I am encouraged by Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain's words when he spoke in May 1863 to his team of soldiers during the preparation leading to the Battle of Little Round Top, a battle which proved critical to holding the Union soldiers' line, which in turn proved critical to victory at Gettysburg, a turning point in the American Civil War. This is what Chamberlain said: "We know not the future and cannot plan for it much, but we can determine and know what manner of men will be whenever and wherever that hour strikes." In 2021, 158 years since the words were spoken by Chamberlain, I submit to you here today at this wonderful symposium that these islands must actively invest in human capital and its support infrastructure if we are to secure a strong economy for future generations of citizens and stakeholders. And so I trust that I have sufficiently interrogated and interpreted some of Dr. Roy Borden's dreams and aspirations in the area of human capital development. And I trust that these ideas, solutions, and initiatives may find fertile soil and ignite themselves into eternal flames of enlightenment and nation building for our 3 Cayman Islands. I thank you kindly.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Roy Borden for having such a forum where we can basically discuss and present and engage in dialogue on various intellectual topics and ideas. I'd also like to thank Dr. Livingston Smith for organizing this event, and also the Cayman Islands National Foundation. And of course, Dr. Cooper for doing a great job moderating these past 2 days. The topic I will be speaking on is the migration of Jamaican/Caribbean women to the Cayman Islands. It's Jamaican/ because even though I will be focusing on Jamaican women, it can be applied to women across the Caribbean. And specifically, I would be looking at working class women, because we know there are many Jamaican professional women who have migrated to Cayman Islands, but this is the group I chose to focus on. Before I actually begin, I would like to draw your attention to this book, Stories My Grandfather Never Told Me. There is a story in this book, which is the first story, How Pa Freddy Lost the Title. I thought this particular story was very, very significant and symbolic, because even though it was rich in imagery and it came across as a story, I saw it highly symbolic and representative of the process from colonialism to decolonization. And I will just give a synopsis of the story for those of you who never read it, because it basically forms the backdrop for what I'm going to talk about. So basically, Pa Freddy was the village authority, and he was the most knowledgeable. And I noticed that word knowledge was used several times in the chapter. It was quite significant. He was very knowledgeable because he was never once wrong in predicting the weather. As a result of that knowledge, he had a lot of power. So we immediately see that linking, that post-colonial theorization coming out, the link between knowledge, power. We see Foucault coming out a little bit here. And no one was able to challenge his knowledge. In addition, he economically exploited, I would say, the villagers, because when they wanted to find out what the weather would be like, they had to pay him 6 pence, right? And he said, listen, I'm not going to charge you, but you'd better not give me less than 6 pence. And one day he was challenged because someone else saw, and I'm summarizing here, someone else, other people had seen it was going to rain. But for Pa Freddy, it was not the fact that it was going to rain that bothered him, it's the fact that someone else thought it was going to rain first. So you had someone else, and then it was really the village idiot who challenged him, right? Slokey, I believe his name was. And then others came along and challenged Slokey, Pa Freddy. To me, Pa Freddy represented, the colonizer in terms and also Western dominant forms of knowledge, in terms of Western hegemony and that sort of thing. And Slokey represented the Frantz Fanons of the earth, right? The wretched of the earth, who basically challenged the colonial rule, and post-colonial writers who challenged Western academic discourse. So, and when it rained, what was so noteworthy in that story was the painful process Pa Freddy experienced of having to admit he was wrong, but give up some of that power, right? How did the colonizers feel when they were giving liberation, right? When they were being challenged. And even though he was humiliated in the end, because it rained, Pa Freddy still didn't give up. He still considered himself as an authority. So even though in the Caribbean, we did experience decolonization, and I'm not talking terms necessarily of Cayman here, because we know there's that debate, whether Cayman was a colony or not, and it's still a dependent. We're not going there. But what we're talking about is from the perspective of Jamaica being decolonized. Pa Freddy still did not give up his power. So I'm saying that even though we are decolonized, the Caribbean, Jamaica was liberated, the West never gave up their power. We see exploitation still taking place in the form of neoliberal policies and structural adjustment. And because I am focusing on the contemporary period of migration, my position is that imperialism and Western hegemony still prevails in being a catalyst in the migration of Jamaican women to the Cayman Islands. Can I have my water? Thank you. Okay, Leela Gandhi's concept of colonialism, I'm quoting, she said, colonialism is insidious in its commitment to the conquest, occupation of minds and selves of culture. We see in the contemporary period, structural adjustment was a major catalyst in inciting Caribbean migration or Jamaican migration. So this paper basically is an overview and integration of theoretical approaches in which we can explain migration, Caribbean migration. And in looking at the literature, I examined approaches that were couched in a critical theoretical framework. So we looked at feminist epistemology, dependency theory, the historical structuralist perspective, and we examined authors such as Gunda Frank and Saskia Sassen and others. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to get into the effects of structural adjustment on Jamaican women, but I would say this. The literature suggests that it had a more adverse effect on Jamaican women than men, because 45% of Jamaican women, between 24 to 40% of Jamaican women were heads of households. And we see Joan French in her article, Hitting Where It Hurts, Jamaican Women's Livelihood in Crisis, observed a high correlation between the migration of Jamaican working class women and periods of stringent adjustment policies. So we see that structural adjustment, even though it was supposed to be beneficial, according to the Friedmans of the world, we lend you money, we help you take charge of your economy, we've got to teach you how to manage your economy, we'll help you. You follow our policies and you'd be fine. We saw that did not occur. So we see that in looking at some of the effects, and I'm just glossing over, there was a high number of malnutrition among pregnant women in 1981, and this was according to Pamela Spar. And Derry and French write, never in the history of Jamaica has there been such a phenomenal rise in the price of basic goods, which contributed to pregnant women being anemic, and there was also a deterioration in child and adult health care. We see also the Bustamante Children's Hospital recorded a rise in admittance of children under 5 with malnutrition. And I focused a lot on malnutrition and women's health there. So the question becomes, what were Jamaican women expected to do? Could they have waited for stimulus checks in the mail? They couldn't go down to the welfare office and demand money. And like the leprous men in the Bible, they decided, we're not going to sit down here and die, but we're going to do something about it. And this is where the image-led approach, and I'm just looking at a part of the image-led approach, it looks at the agency of Jamaican working-class women. They did not have to migrate because migration costs. Okay, so we're looking at women who are, I won't say starving, but they couldn't even afford basic food for their children. Services were privatized, so how on earth could they have gotten money to migrate? But because they're ambitious, and I will, in writing, when I do, I'm looking for the literature, what I have in my notes that talks about the determination of Jamaican women. I will find it just now. As I said, I had to. Anyway, we'll come to that. But the image-led approach said Jamaican women will find a way. They're not going to sit down and starve. So basically, how were they going to get to Cayman Islands? We all know Cayman Islands is a very expensive place, right? Network theory explains how that works. Basically, when we're looking at network theory, we're looking at, we're stressing the agency of the migrants, the potential migrants, but we're also looking at the concept of social capital in facilitating and helping these women to make the decision whether to migrate or not. So when we're talking about social capital as part of network theory, we're talking about knowledge, a form of knowledge. Knowledge of the costs and benefits of migrating to a particular destination. And Thomas Hopes and Massey talks about this. So basically, these women had access to knowledge, assistance, and other resources because their networks in Cayman allowed them and facilitated them to migrate. So for example, they knew someone in Cayman Islands who said, you know what, you come to my house, if when you move to Cayman Islands, you can room with me, we share a room, I lend you money, you pay me back, that sort of thing. So we see network theory was very instrumental in allowing or facilitating the migration of these women. The next question becomes, why Cayman? Why couldn't they go to the States? Well, for several reasons. Roy Bodden's work, The Cayman Islands in Transition, basically sets a backdrop for showing the historical symbiotic relationship between Jamaica and Cayman. Okay, so we see the cultural ties, the historical ties, etc. So that basically shows why Cayman was an obvious choice. However, I don't know why I'm so breathless. Thank you. However, Saskia Sassen's concepts of global cities really sheds light on also why Cayman was a preferred destination. So we know that at one time, Cayman Islands was the 5th largest financial center in the world. However, when Saskia Sassen is talking about global cities, she's looking at the global economy. And she's saying the global economy, of course, has basically shifted. It's still industrialized, but from industry to service and finances. And she basically said the global economy is managed and operated in certain key cities. She said the global city represents a strategic place where global processes are managed. So basically, we're looking at how finance is managed. And they serve, she also said that they serve as command centers. And we notice Cayman does that. A key feature of global cities is that there are two sets of labor, high sectors rather, the high-wage sector and the low-wage sector. And she basically says that there's a high demand for domestic workers and other migrant women in global cities. Because what happens, and I will stick to time, so I will just summarize everything. She says basically what happens is that, let me skip again, I'm so sorry, but I'm skipping. I'm trying to see how I could just get everything in. But there is the professional sector and then the low-wage sector. And Rachel Perenas interjects here by looking at reproductive labor in the global economy. So in these global cities that is service-oriented, we see that the local woman, which is the local Caymanian woman, there are more job opportunities for them in the workplace. So in law firms, and I will back up everything by the literature, so there is need in global cities for female labor as well. So even though I just said that it's a high-wage sector and basically a low-wage sector, there's also a middle range where the local women are pulled in. So we see in Cayman Islands, and we heard yesterday, a lot of the presenters, or some of the presenters, spoke about Caymanian women being independent. And it is my position that because Cayman Islands mirrors a global city, Caymanian women, being economically independent, choose to go into the workforce. And according to global city theorizing, they're positioned as secretaries, legal secretaries, administrators, etc. When that happens, what do you think happens to their children? They've got to employ domestics, and it's called the reproductive labor of the global economy. According to Perenas, due to global restructuring, reproductive work has shifted from the home to the marketplace, especially in global cities. So she describes it as a three-tier system where you have the first world woman, which would be the Caymanian woman in global cities, right? We are saying the Cayman Islands can be likened to a global city. So they're in the first tier, and they need migrant women, which is the Jamaican woman, second tier, to come and take care of their children. However, there's a third level where the women in Jamaica have to rely on other females to take care of their children. So that dynamic is very interesting. And this leads us to the whole dynamic of transcultural theory. Wrapping up now. So transnational theory, I will jump again, and we'll look at the new economics of migration theory, because this looks at the household level of migration. So basically, this theory says, look, the Jamaican working class woman migrated because it was a household decision. And because a significant portion of Jamaican women are heads of households, they migrate to Cayman not on a permanent basis, but on a rotational basis. And we see the laws here facilitate that. Okay, you've got to go back when your work permit is up. And secondly of all, the transnational theory says there are links are maintained between the sending country and the host country. So in other words, Jamaican women, when they come to Cayman Islands, they still have to take care of their children back home. And they do so through technology. And the literature talks about the importance of telephone calls, WhatsApp. I didn't get the literature for WhatsApp, but I'm going to search and I'm sure it's there. And also Facebook, transportation, air transportation. It also looks at financial institutions, and in our case, we have JN Money Transfer. Yeah, JN Money Transfer. So basically, the transnational theory tells us that there is a link between the host country, the migrant rather, maintains that link between the host country and their country of origin. So I will stop here, but in my paper, when I write it, I will also talk about cultural hybridity, Homi Bhabha's concept of first, second, and third space in colonialism, and we will also see how that works with Jamaican migrants in the Cayman Islands. So that's it.
I submitted some slides, so if they could be pulled up, I appreciate it. Thank you. Right, so first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers of this conference, and in particular, our very esteemed moderator, to invite me to present part of my research to all of you today. In my normal life, professional activities, I wear many hats. So here I am the Master of Laws course leader in international finance. I work for the well-reputed Truman Bodden Law School on Ireland. I'm also an honorary teacher by the University of Liverpool in the UK. And in addition to that, I have been given the opportunity to become a member of the Public Procurement Committee within the Cayman Islands government. Despite wearing these many hats, today I'd like to abstract myself a bit and not wear any in particular. I come as a very humble researcher that is fondly interested in the history and tradition and laws of the Cayman Islands. So what I'd like to do today is to present an introduction to public procurement and drawing on the work some of Dr. Bodden to emphasize how public procurement can meaningfully lead to civic engagement. So the aim that I have today is just to provide a very easygoing introduction to public procurement and to actually empower all of you so that you're aware of all the tools that public procurement offers you. I met Dr. Bodden for the first time in my first couple of months in Cayman when I decided to take the History and Government of the Cayman Islands course with Dr. Chris Williams. And my first introduction to his works was Dr. Williams's and Dr. Bodden's discussion on whether Cayman is was a society of slaves or a slave society, which opened a whole new world for me as a researcher, and it just got me drawn into it. So that empowered me to apply the knowledge that I have brought from my professional career into seeing what can be done to advance Caymanian society and its development. So it is this appreciation for Cayman that has drawn me here and that has drawn me to develop my research. So starting with public procurement, I'm aware that this is the only presentation that's separating you from lunch, so I'm going to have to make it as engaging as I can. So public procurement is a dry, boring topic that I don't absolutely love, and I'd like to transfer some of that passion to you. Public procurement is that area of the law that covers the purchases that government does with private parties. So we know that government can do many things, but for so many others, they have to rely on the private sector. They have to do contracts with them for all sorts of goods, services, or works. And when they do so, each purchase that they do is regulated by law. This is important because of the distinction between private and public money. When government contracts, they do so with public money. Thus, they owe certain principles to their citizens, mainly that of accountability. When somebody spends money as a private citizen, they can do anything they please with it, and they will be more accountable or less accountable to those persons that they choose to, but that is not the case of the government. So they have to be extremely cautious on what they do and how it's conducted. Public procurement is important because on the amount of business that it brings. Latest figures by the Central Procurement Office here in Cayman prove that there is about 100 million plus of CI dollars undertaken every year through procurement. And as our community grows and as the country grows, that can only increase by the force of events. So this is why it's absolutely important that the government decided to push forward legislation to make sure that all of these purchases are properly regulated. And what did they do? Well, they do the three main actions that you see on screen. The first one is they passed a legal framework. They passed an act, back then a law, and their regulations. The Public Procurement Act was enacted in 2016, the regulations followed in 2018, and the whole system entered into force in May 2018. I am lucky enough to have been in Cayman right after the Public Procurement Act was enacted and to have followed how the system has grown and has been built from the very beginning. There's also a second point of institutions, like the kinds of bodies that get involved with public procurement practice. And there are three main ones. First, there's the Central Procurement Office, then there's the Entity Procurement Committees and Public Procurement Committee. So allow me to draw a bit more of your patience for a couple of minutes. So the Central Procurement Office is that body within government that works as a one-stop shop for all things government. All things procurement within government. So if any of the civil servants feels that they need assistance or they just want to ask questions or they want to see how they can improve their practice, they can direct the questions directly at the Central Procurement Office. Then there's also, within each ministry or statutory authority, they do have their own body, providing not only support, but also accountability. These are the entity procurement committees. There's a paper trail that supports them, and they have to justify every purchase, and they have to prove that it's strictly compliant with the legal framework. There's also the Public Procurement Committee. This is a group of 9 appointed members, in which I can include myself, and we bring all sorts of paths of life and interests and expertise. And we do review those projects that are of higher value, that is $250,000 CA dollars plus, or those that are direct awards, so those that have not been competed, but it has just decided that a specific person can provide it, or business. In addition to all of these bodies, which is already quite a significant network ensuring accountability, there's also our default ordinary government mechanisms, such as the Public Accounts Committee or even the House of Parliament, that can review all the contracts that government produces to make sure that they are, again, like strictly according to the law. The third strategy that the laws follow is that of principles. Now, principles are not strictly law, so they are not enforceable like word by word, but they provide guidelines on decision making. So when the law might not be clear, or when a civil servant needs some assistance on how to structure a process, they can always fall onto the principles. And this will resonate among many of you possibly. So we have, first and foremost, that of accountability. From what we said before, we need to make sure that when public money is spent, that it's spent as best as it can be, and that we are all kept accountable, and that all decisions have a paper trail that back them, and that they are done in the interest of Caymanians. The second one is that of competitive supply. This essentially means that any process, wherever this can be made possible, has to be competed. That is, the information on the good service or work that government needs is publicized. It's available for anyone that might want to trade with the government. They know, well, the government would publicize all the main rules on what they want, and then it is open to everyone to check this information and to decide to put what we like to call a bid. So to say, yes, I can do this, that is the specific good that I'm offering, that is the price I would like to get. And then government will have to consider all of those. Then there's also consistency, in the sense that all policies within government have to go in line so that everybody in government knows where we stand. Effectiveness, and very crucially, value for money. It's about getting the best deal for all the Caymanian citizenship. So that brings us to what are the links to Roy Borden's scholarship. Now, he doesn't deal specifically, to my knowledge at least, with the topic of public procurement, but nevertheless, his works provide deep inspiration to all of us that work in public procurement. Mostly there are 3 themes in Roy Borden's scholarship that can be interpreted in the light of public procurement. And those are the elite-driven development, the concept of patronage that he derives from his political studies, and the empowerment of all Caymanians. So these are the 3 topics where I have found inspiration, I have found a link with public procurement. They are mostly developed, like the 2 books that I draw this inspiration from are The Cayman Islands in Transition and Patronage, Personalities and Parties. So these are the 2 works that have a more powerful link with what I do as a researcher. First of all, in his concept of elites, he covers that crucially from 1950s to 2000s, he demonstrates that he believes in his words, multicultural, multinational, plural society, which the Cayman Islands should become. The way I see it is that when public procurement is providing this openness and these mechanisms to check, it's actually drawing everybody in. It's being inclusive. It is getting away from the idea of the elite-driven development and giving a chance to everyone to interact with government business. With public procurement as a facilitator of these ideas that Dr. Borden would like to see. The second is that of patronage. So Dr. Bodden makes a reference to analysis, and again, his words, not mine. The analysis of political developments in the Cayman Islands since 1950s leads to the observation that Caymanian politics have been dominated by a self-serving merchant elite. So there is this concern that this merchant establishment are being used, or they are perpetrating their position as gatekeepers. And that is another of the issues that public procurement wants to tackle and wants to aim to dispel. So when opening government business, what we are doing is we're going away from that merchant society, and we are demonstrating that all businesses can actually compete for this project that is being advertised. And the third topic that inspires some connection with public procurement is that of empowerment of all Caymanians. All Caymanians, even micro and small businesses, which we know that are a very important part of our community, have got a chance to get to know which projects are available and to effectively compete for them. And it is this very last point where I'd like to draw your attention. So it's all about empowering Caymanians. It's all about showing you what you all can do, like the range of tools that you've got accessible to interact with government, to get to know more, and to drive our society forward. So drawing inspiration from this concept of civic engagement that I extracted from Dr. Bodden's works, I'd like to cover 4 different topics. So the first of all is that of competition. That is one of the principles that I briefly mentioned before. And it states that whenever possible, there has to be open competition in all government contracts. That is, the project is properly advertised, everybody has a chance to know that information, everybody is given at least 15 business days to be able to come up with a bid, and everyone can be considered. Every bid is reviewed. Direct awards, which are those that are non-competed, are seen very strictly in the legislation. They are considered as a last resort only in those cases that the law foresees. Otherwise, they are just not permitted. In all these circumstances, every project is backed by a paper trail, so it can be followed through if the need arises. The second aspect is that of bidding. So especially if you're a business owner, you can register in a designated website and register your interest, and then whenever a project in your specialization subject becomes available, an automatic notification is sent to you, so that you know firsthand, at the very first minute that it is published, that that project is there, so that you have enough time to prepare and you give yourself the best chance. So all the projects have to be advertised in the website, and thus everyone has access to that information. Then the third aspect is that of the economic development preference. Public procurement here and in many other jurisdictions, but crucially in Cayman, navigates competing pressures sometimes on the economic development that the economic development preference puts together. So where do we trade? Who do we trade with? Do we trade locally and keep the business locally and keep the money flowing around? Or do we need to look at international providers? And the Public Procurement Act, what it says about this is that in assessing value for money, an entity shall consider the socio-economic impact and benefits that a procurement project may create, particularly, this is perhaps the bit that would interest you the most, particularly as it relates to small and medium-sized suppliers that are operating in the islands. And all those working in public procurement have got instruments to make sure that the economic development preference is applied wherever possible. So essentially, when they review a procedure, they have to publish before like what kind of things they want, a series of criteria, and each criteria is assigned a number of points. And the person that ends up getting the business is the one that has scored higher after all these points are counted. There are a couple of points that entities can award in terms of the economic development preference. So to make sure that wherever possible, that is applied. And then the fourth mechanism that you will have to engage with public procurement is that of contesting the process. And there are many opportunities to do so. So you have, for a start, the procurement website that has got all this boring information that I do love and that I'm sure that you will eventually too once you know all the mechanisms that you have available. But there's also the annual procurement plans. So the government would start publishing, they have already started just this year, but they will start publishing annually procurement plans so that you, especially the business owners, know what will be possibly coming during the year so that you can prepare even more in advance. And if you decide to bid, to put a proposal forward for one of the projects, there are many opportunities that you can also use to gather more information. So for instance, if you have been successful in getting a project, well done you can go ahead. If you haven't, you have rights to what we like to call debriefing, which is that you can contact the authority or government department or ministry that was in charge of the project and ask for the reasons why your bid was not the chosen one. Even if you are not happy with the debriefing, you still can complain about the result of the project and the award if you have been bidding for it. And then finally, because we have a legal framework, if you're really, really unhappy and you feel that your bid hasn't been given a fair chance, you still have all the mechanisms stemming from the judicial process and all its protections. So there you go. So drawing inspiration, just to wrap up, drawing inspiration from Dr. Bodden's works, I came up with his view on civic engagement for the advancement of Caymanian society, and that is why I chose to focus on all these many tools that all of you have to make sure that you participate in public procurement. So the system was set only 5 years ago, and there are still things that are unearthed by practice. But government is following a proactive approach. They are introducing reforms whenever they are needed, and they also have been monitoring very closely as a researcher as well. And finally, public procurement is very important now already, but it would become even more important in the post-pandemic world and recovery, because as public procurement is getting used to become an effective policy tool. And on that note, thank you very much. I hope that all of this made sense and that you were properly entertained prior to the lunch. And if there is time, I invite questions.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, we are about to go to lunch, but we have just about 2 minutes to accommodate maybe one question. I know Professor Mubarak had a question. If you could go ahead, please. There's a mic on this side for you, please.
Actually, I had raised my hand for Lorraine earlier, but I'll just ask one question each, if that's okay. So on public procurement, I'm wondering if you've seen any data on whether there's variation in the prices paid by different government departments for the same or similar items. Right? That would be one way to understand whether there's efficiency gains that can be made in one government department relative to what we see from others. So that's one question, and then I can wait till you answer, and then I'll ask Lorraine.
I will collect some more questions to address this one. One of the main difficulties about public procurement research is that it should be very data-driven, but we don't have, it's very data poor even now generally. So we only have data, consistent data for the last 5 years since the framework was implemented. Having said that, it's extremely difficult and perhaps a bit misleading to deal with the data on an annual basis because we have been exposed to many price increases. And for instance, all of those of you that might have been involved in development of real estate would know that this has been the case. The data is available there now, and it's on the website, but there has to be some work in collecting it. I must say the Central Procurement Office do everything that they can, and they do a great job, provided that they are like 3 people. And the system is improving and they are generating the data progressively. So it is public and it is out there, but there's no comparative study as of yet.
Okay. Oh, so, thanks very much. And I do have a question for Lorraine, if that's okay. And I guess this is a theme that, what you just said is a theme that I've noticed for the past couple of days. It would be really great for the island to develop better data processes that could inform all of our work, including work on migration. And so Lorraine, on that, I'm wondering, we talked a lot about theory in your talk, thanks very much, but I'm wondering, like, if you were to take a policy intervention type approach, right? Do you think there are any role for government to improve the efficiency of this migration corridor? Like, are there support services that should be provided to Jamaican and other Caribbean women? Are there ways that we should be recruiting so that it's not only based on their networks and informal connections, which is kind of ad hoc, right? But where we can get the best talent in the Cayman Islands, just by doing some kind of systematic recruiting and things like that.
Well, I understand what you're saying, but the literature suggests that unfortunately, because in the global economy, let's say domestic workers, domestic work, child care, and other jobs in that category is considered as low-wage work, and it has a very low status. It is not prioritized by government in that sense, as opposed to, let's say, professional services. We do see, though, that in the Philippines, you see their government is actively, actually in terms of the sending government, they do have, they ensure that they have mechanisms in place. So the receiving country can actually take them and give them jobs. But I will say in the Cayman Islands, we don't have that. There should be, and hopefully we will get there. But then again, there is the argument that some of these women were professionals in the sense that they were teachers, etc. So why should we confine them to domestic work and low-wage work? If they were, let's say, semi-professionals, why can't we have a policy where we can place them in different occupations? But again, this is getting into a lot of stuff here because the racial dynamics in terms of globalization, the racial dynamics of placing women looks at race, class, skin color. So even though they may be qualified, receiving governments are often perpetuate stereotypes in terms of placing these women. So whereas it's an ideal and it's something that should happen, in reality, because of prejudices and stereotypes, I don't know if it would happen. We'd see. But thank you.
That's okay. I was going to say that I can hook you both up in a few minutes, We can meet right here and continue that discussion. Absolutely. But ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for our panel. And this is where we do break for lunch. I'm going to ask that you be reminded that Subway has boxed meals for purchase at the theater in the concession area at the back. We will resume at exactly 12:35 p.m. to have our final panel. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We will see you again very soon.